the guy who always quoted policy and rolled his eyes at ghost stories the older staff told around the fire. That changed on a Tuesday shift in late September. The night a simple welfare check in the Upper Geyser Basin turned into something I still cannot explain without my hands starting to shake. It started with what sounded like an ordinary call. Day shift had taken a report from a hostel in West Yellowstone about a solo traveler who had not come back before closing. A woman in her 30s, hiking boots, small day pack, lots of photos of geysers on social media. Her last confirmed sighting was near one of the boardwalk loops, headed out just before sunset. By the time my shift rolled around, her car was still in the lot and she had not answered her phone. On busy weekends, that kind of thing can be a late bus or a forgotten charger. In September, with a cold front moving in and fewer crowds to hide in, it gets bumped up the list. I volunteered to walk the basin. I told my supervisor it would be good exercise and that the missing hiker would probably be sitting on a bench somewhere, wrapped in a hoodie, embarrassed when I showed up with a flashlight and a radio. That was genuinely what I believed as I parked by the trailhead and stepped out into that particular kind of darkness you only get around thermal features, where the steam swallows distance and light at the same time. If you have never been in a geyser basin after closing, there is no good way to describe how wrong it feels. The same places that look magical in postcards start to feel like open mouths. The boardwalk creaks under your boots, and every hiss of steam sounds like something drawing breath. The air smells like sulfur and hot metal, and the temperature swings between chilled and almost feverish, depending on where the wind blows the vapor. My headlamp beam cut a narrow tunnel through the fog, pulling pale shapes of railings and warning signs out of the black. I walked the upper loop first, calling her first name every few minutes the way we are trained to do. Nothing answered except the constant bubbling of pools and the occasional low roar of a vent. I checked every bench, every little spur trail that led to an overlook. No pack, no person, no dropped phone. I kept telling myself that this was good, that no sign meant she was probably already somewhere warm and annoyed with spotty reception. Halfway down the main stretch, I saw it. A dark shape on the boardwalk, just past one of the stay-on-trail signs that visitors pose with for photos. For a second, my brain insisted it was just another shadow thrown by my headlamp. But as I got closer, the outline sharpened. A boot, brown leather, women's size, lying on its side with the laces splayed like it had been stepped out of in a hurry. I crouched beside it and felt the first real knot of unease. The boot was warm, but not from a foot. The sole had picked up heat from the boardwalk. A folded park map lay beside it, weighted with a small rock, as if someone had intentionally left those items there to be found. The hair on my arms lifted. People drop gear all the time, but they do not usually arrange it. I swept my headlamp over the gap between the railings and the thin crust beyond. At first, I saw only steam and the faint shimmer that tells you the ground is carrying more heat than it should. Then my beam caught something else. A pair of shallow drag marks, starting at the edge of the planks and running out across the pale surface until the fog swallowed them. Not footprints, not animal tracks. Two wide lines like something heavy had been pulled or pushed. Training kicked in. I keyed my radio and gave my location, told them I had personal effects likely belonging to the missing hiker and possible sign of off-trail travel. My supervisor's voice came back calmer than I felt, telling me to hold position, not to attempt a rescue on unstable ground, and that he was dispatching another ranger with thermal imaging from the parking lot side. Standard, reassuring, familiar. What was not familiar was the way the steam shifted as I waited. It usually blows with the wind in long, predictable currents. That night, it seemed to twist in small circles around the drag marks, thickening until the beam from my headlamp bounced right back at me. The basin went strangely quiet. The constant small sounds of boiling water and hissing vents dropped into a kind of muffled hush, like someone throwing a blanket over a working engine. That was when I heard my name. It came from the fog beyond the boardwalk, from the direction of the drag marks. Ryan. Clear, calm, exactly how my supervisor says it when he wants my attention during a briefing. The cadence, the slight downward lilt at the end, all of it the same. I did what anyone would do. I lifted my radio. "Yeah, I copy," I said, feeling stupidly relieved. "I am still at the last coordinates I sent. You almost here?" There was a pause. Then his actual voice came crackling through, sharpened with confusion. "Repeat last, Ryan. I did not call you. I am still 5 minutes out from the lot." I stared at the radio, then back at the fog. There had been no static in the voice I heard, no electronic distortion. It had come from the air itself, from the white wall in front of me. I told myself I was tired, that the sulfur smell was giving me a headache, that I had misheard some shifting of steam and distant conversation. I told myself a lot of things in the next 30 seconds that I no longer believe. Ryan. The second time was closer, right at the edge of the boardwalk, somewhere below eye level. The same familiar tone, but there was something underneath it now, something like a whisper riding just behind the main sound. I stepped backward without meaning to, the boards creaking under my boots. Every rule we have pounded into us about staying on the walkway started flashing through my head. Thin crust, scalding pools. People who die out here do not go quickly. The training videos show pictures they usually do not show the public. Skin that looks boiled, clothing melted to flesh. The rational part of my brain told me that if the missing hiker had gone over, she was already beyond help. The rest of me was listening to my own name being spoken in a voice that knew exactly how to make me trust it. I swept my light slowly along the gap again, forcing my hands to stay steady. For a moment, there was nothing but swirling white. Then, for just long enough to register, the steam thinned. Something was out there on the crust. Not standing, not exactly. It looked like a human figure hunched low, one arm extended toward the boardwalk. The skin that showed in my light was pale in some places, dark and wet in others, as if parts of it had cooked and sloughed. The face, if that was what I was seeing, was turned away. What caught my attention more than anything was the fact that the figure was not where any living human should have been able to stand. The crust there was thin enough that even a bison can punch through. I knew that from rescue training. I knew it in my bones. The steam rolled back over it in a gust of sulfur and heat, hiding everything. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I must have made some kind of sound because the voice in the fog changed. It stopped sounding like my supervisor. The structure of the words stayed the same, but something in the pitch slid sideways, like a recording slowing down and speeding up at the same time. "Please," it said, "you have to come off the boards. I cannot reach." There was a note in that last word that made every instinct in me rebel. I have worked enough trauma calls to recognize genuine panic. This was not it. There was no urgency, no stumbling over syllables, no breathlessness. It sounded like someone doing a very good impression of distress without understanding what it actually feels like. I do not know how long I stood there. breathing in shallow, sulfur-tainted gasps, staring into a blank wall of white. I remember thinking about all the stories rangers tell each other at the end of the season. The disappearances that never added up. The search grids that turned up neatly stacked clothing with no footprints leading away. The half-joking way people would say, "The park takes who it wants." I used to hate that phrase. That night it wrapped around my ribs like a hand. I forced myself to talk. "Ma'am, if you can hear me, you need to move toward my voice without leaving solid ground. I cannot come out there to you. The boardwalk is the only safe." "Ryan." This time it was almost a hiss. The voice cut across mine, sharp and irritated, like a parent shushing a child. "You do not leave people behind." It knew my training. It knew exactly which string to pluck. In EMT school, they hammered a particular line into us. "You do not abandon a patient who is still viable." I had repeated that line out loud in more than one debrief. I had never said it around my current crew. Hearing those specific words thrown back at me in the fog snapped something I did not realize was brittle. I took another step back. My heel hit the upright of a safety sign and stopped me. The boardwalk behind me curved away into the dark. Ahead of me lay nothing but steam and those twin drag marks whispering into the unknown. For a second, I truly believed that if I stayed where I was, something would eventually reach up through that gap and grab my ankle. The urge to run fought with the urge to freeze. Headlights cut through the trees behind me, spattering weak light across the rails. Another ranger's voice came over the radio, this time in the normal way, wind noise and all, asking for my exact position again. The spell broke like glass. "I am by marker 7 on the upper loop," I said, louder than I meant to. "Advise extreme caution. I have probable fatality off boardwalk, unstable ground, and auditory anomalies." I hated the way that sounded, but there was no other phrase that fit. As soon as I spoke to someone who was verifiably real and approaching, the basin changed. The ambient noise returned in a rush. Gurgling pools, distant loud vent, the small crackle of cooling boards. The steam in front of me started moving with the wind again. No more circular eddies, no more voice. My partner joined me within a couple of minutes, his face pinched against the smell and the cold. We secured the area, logged the location of the boot and the map, and did what we could from the safety of the planks. Thermal imaging picked up an irregular hot mass beyond the edge of the boardwalk, right where those drag marks disappeared. A specialist team with the right gear confirmed what we already suspected the next day. Human remains, not intact, not accessible without risking another life. The official report says the missing hiker disregarded multiple warnings, left the designated path, and fell through thin crust into a scalding runoff channel. It lists the cause of death in clinical terms I am not going to repeat. There is no mention of the arranged boot, the map weighed down with a rock, or the voice that said my name before anyone had broadcast it over the radio. There is certainly no line about a shape in the fog, standing where no one should stand. People ask why I left after that season. I tell them it was burnout, that I wanted steadier work, something closer to family. All of that is true. It is not the whole truth. The part I do not say is this. A week after the recovery, I woke up in my apartment in town to the smell of sulfur and the sound of somebody whispering my name from the corner of the room. Where the odor, steam from my shower usually hangs the longest. The window was closed, the vent was off. There was no visible fog. Just that voice, patient and amused, saying, "You do not leave people behind, Ryan." not even when the boards end. I moved out of Yellowstone the following month. I have not set foot on a geyser basin boardwalk since. And on cold nights, when condensation crawls across the bathroom mirror and I see shapes in it that do not quite match my own reflection, I remember the drag marks and the hand reaching from impossible ground. And I wonder how many stories we have written off as visitor error that were actually something else reaching through the fog, learning how to sound like the people we trust most. I used to love the smell of smoke. Most people hear that and think of house fires or cigarettes. But for me, it was always campfires and controlled burns. That sharp, dry scent that meant the forest was doing what it needed to do. Fire is part of the cycle. That is what they teach you in ranger training. What they do not teach you is what happens when something refuses to burn. My name is Ella, and the last season I worked in Yellowstone, I was assigned to monitor a burn scar that never behaved the way it should have. The summer before, a lightning strike had taken out a big chunk of forest on the edge of my district. It had been a hot year, dry needles piled deep, and even with the best efforts from the crews, it ran hotter and longer than anyone liked. By the time it was out, the hillside was a skeleton. Black tree trunks, ash drifting underfoot. The earth itself baked into hard, cracked plates. Ugly, but ecologists were excited. That kind of disturbance opens up light for new growth. Life follows fire. That is the cycle. My job that fall was simple on paper. Hike the perimeter, document regrowth, flag hazard trees, and make sure tourists were not wandering into unstable areas for the perfect Instagram shot. I spent weeks crunching over charcoal, taking notes on tiny shoots of green pushing through the ash. It felt hopeful in a way. The forest was wounded, but it was healing. There was just one exception. The first time I saw the spared place, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I had been following a GPS line along the upper edge of the burn, the black scar on one side and unburned forest on the other. It was tedious work, side hilling on loose soil, breathing in dust that tasted faintly of old smoke. I came around a bend between two big granite outcrops and had to stop, because ahead of me, the world was wrong. Imagine walking through a war zone and finding one untouched house in the middle of the rubble. That is what it felt like. The whole slope had burned hot, all the way to the ridgeline, except for a roughly oval patch the size of a small meadow. Inside that boundary, the trees were green. The ground was covered in moss. Fallen logs lay intact instead of reduced to white ash. It looked like a piece of forest someone had cut out from a photo taken years earlier and glued over the present. I checked my map twice to make sure I was not just misreading an edge. The burn perimeter line on the tablet ran right through where I was standing. According to the data, this spot should have gone up like everything else. But the trunks at the boundary told a different story. They were charred black on the outside, yes, but only on the side facing out. The inner halves were untouched, bark still rough and living under my hand. I stepped closer, boots leaving prints in the ash until I hit the line where the ground changed. On one side, gray dust puffed up around my laces. On the other, the soil was damp and springy, a thin layer of green moss damping my footsteps. The air felt cooler inside that invisible circle, quieter somehow. Even the distant sound of the wind seemed to dim. In the center of the spared grove was a cluster of stones, stacked in a low ring about knee-high. Not quite a fire ring, not quite a cairn. 4 larger rocks formed the corners of what could have been a square if it had been laid out more precisely. Someone had taken time with it, though. The stones were not random. They were chosen, flatter faces inward, lichens scraped off in places to reveal pale granite beneath. I walked around it once, counting my steps. 12 paces across in any direction. The middle of the ring was bare earth, darker than the soil outside, and just damp enough to hold the impression of my boot when I tested it. No sprouts, no needles, just that dark circle of exposed dirt. On the second circuit, I noticed the carving. It was on the inside edge of one of the corner stones, not obvious unless you were standing in the ring and looking down. A smooth oval had been scraped clean, and in the center of that, someone had cut a simple shape, a vertical line with 2 short bars crossing it near the top. It could have been a crude tree or a figure with its arms raised, or nothing at all if you were feeling generous. The grooves were shallow but sharp, like they had been made with a good knife and a patient hand. I should have left it alone. I know that now. At the time, it felt like a find, a human element in an otherwise impersonal assignment. Something I could photograph, log, and maybe joke about later back at the station. Found some backcountry art in the burn, that sort of thing. Instead, I did something stupid. I reached down and brushed my fingers over the carving. A small flat disc of stone, about the size of a coin, broke free from a crack near the etched lines and dropped into my palm. It was oddly smooth on one side, rough on the other. The same symbol was scratched into its face, more hastily, like a quick copy. I turned it over once, twice, then slipped it into the breast pocket of my uniform shirt. I do not know why. Maybe I thought of it as a piece of the story of this place, a little talisman from a forest that had refused to burn. Maybe I was just tired and not thinking clearly. On my way out of the grove, I almost walked into another ranger. He was one of the old-timers, gray beard, leathery face, the kind of man who had a story about every rock and ridge. I had seen his name on rosters, shared radio channels with him, but we had never spent much time in the field together. He stood just outside the green boundary, boots planted in ash, eyes fixed on the stone ring behind me. "Did you step in there?" he asked. I stopped. "Yeah, just documenting. It is strange how it missed this spot." He nodded once, slowly. "We call it the spared place," he said. "Locals had other names for it, long before the park. You should not linger." I tried to keep my tone light. "Well, the fire seems to agree with them. Did you see that ring before the burn?" His gaze flicked to my chest, just for a second. Later, I would wonder if he had seen the slight bulge the stone disc made in my pocket. "Some things stand where they stand," he said. "Fire goes around. That is all you need to put in your report." It bothered me on the hike back that he had not answered my question. It bothered me more that every time I looked over my shoulder, it felt like the ring of stones was closer to the edge of the burn than it should have been, like the blackened trunks had leaned back a step to make more room for it. That night at the cabin, I could not stop thinking about the grove. I should have been exhausted, but my body hummed like I had drunk too much coffee. The little stone token sat on the table beside my bunk, catching the light from the lantern in a way that made the scratched symbol seem deeper. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of fire. Not the roaring wall of flame you see on the news. This was a slow, crawling burn. Tongues of orange licking along the forest floor, turning needles and deadfall into glowing lines. I was standing in the middle of it, watching trees crack and fall, hearing animals fleeing in the dark beyond the light. Only the heat never touched me. It rolled around me like water around a rock, biting at the edges of whatever invisible circle I was standing in, but never crossing it. Somewhere in the smoke, I heard a voice I could not quite make out, as if someone were speaking on the other side of a closed door, just loud enough for me to know I was being addressed. I woke up with my heart pounding and the taste of ash in my mouth. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke, but that was not unusual. The old wood absorbed decades of it. What was unusual was the way my breath steamed in the air, even though the thermometer on the wall said it was 60 degrees inside. My skin felt prickly, like I had just walked in from a cold day. But when I touched my arm, it was warm, almost too warm. I told myself it was a bad dream and got ready for the day. The stone went back into my pocket without me really making a conscious choice. It felt wrong to leave it behind. The strange thing started small. On my next hike into the burn, the air around the spared grove felt a few degrees warmer than the rest of the slope, even though the sun was behind clouds. My water bottle was lukewarm when I pulled it from my pack near the boundary, as if it had been sitting near a stove. When the wind picked up, ash whirled across the hillside, but none of it crossed into the green patch. It hit an invisible line and swirled away, piling in little drifts along the edge like snow against a fence. I laughed it off over the radio the first time I mentioned it. Blake, that was the older ranger's name, did not laugh back. "Just do your job and leave it be," he said. "Places like that have their own arrangements." Arrangements. It was such a strange word choice that it stuck with me. Arrangements with what? Fire, the land, something else? The second night, the smell woke me. Strong this time. Not cabin smoke, but fresh burning, sharp and dry, carried on a wind that rattled the windows. I rolled out of bed, sure there had been a spot flare somewhere near the cabin, and grabbed my boots. By the time I reached the door, the smell was gone. Outside, the stars were clear, the air cutting cold. No glow on the horizon, no distant crackle. Back in my bunk, the immediate danger gone, I realized my pillow was hot. Not just warm from my head, hot, like it had been sitting in the sun. My hand came away slightly damp, and for a panicked moment I thought it was sweat, until I saw the faint gray smudge on my palm. Ash. I started to put the stone on the floor then, to get it away from me. But the idea made my chest tighten with an irrational surge of panic. I compromised by wrapping it in a bandana and tucking it deeper into my pack, telling myself I would drop it off at the station as an interesting find later in the week. On the third day, I realized I was not alone in the spared grove. I had gone up alone, Blake covering another section. Morning light slanted through the black trunks, turning the burn scar into a forest of thin shadows. Inside the green oval, the light was softer, muted by live needles. I walked to the stone ring, counted my usual 12 paces across, and crouched to take another series of photos for comparison. That was when I felt it. The very faint sensation of someone standing just behind me. It was not a sound at first, more like the subtle shift in air you feel when another body moves into your space. The hair on the back of my neck lifted. My throat went dry. I told myself it was just the way the breeze funneled between the rocks, the temperature difference between burned and unburned ground. I did not turn around. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice even. "Blake, if that is you, this is a lousy joke." No answer. The sensation of presence stayed, a pressure between my shoulder blades. Slowly, I stood, camera dangling from its strap. My boots felt heavier than they should have. The symbol on the stone token in my pack seemed to buzz against my spine, even though I knew that was impossible. "I know you are there," I said. "You are not supposed to be in this area. Fire damage." The dry needles overhead rustled. The thing behind me breathed in. It was a subtle sound, almost lost under the wind. A long, slow inhale, like bellows pulling air into a banked coal bed. It started low, then rose in pitch until it scraped just below the range of a human voice. "Ella," something said. My name, drawn out like a log cracking in a hot fire. I spun around. There was no one. Just the circle of green, the ring of stones, the blackened wall of burned trunks beyond. No footprints in the moss but mine. No disturbed ash at the boundary. The air, though, was warmer. Not pleasant warm. Oven warm. My skin prickled, and I realized sweat was beading along my hairline despite the cool day. I backed out of the grove, heart hammering, and did not stop until I was a good 20 yards into the burn scar. There, the air snapped back to the expected temperature, cool with a faint edge of early snow. My breath steamed normally. My hands shook. I almost called it in, almost told a dispatch that I was spooked by a patch of forest that had dodged a fire. Instead, I radioed Blake. "You ever feel watched up by the spared place?" I asked. Silence, then a sigh. "You took something, did you not?" he said. The question hit harder than it should have. "Just a little carved stone," I admitted. "Figured it was some old marker. Why?" "You put it back," he said. "Today, before dark." "What is it?" "A promise," he said. "And you do not want to be on the wrong end of whoever made it." I laughed nervously. "Come on, that sounds like something you tell rookies for fun." "I have been here 30 years, he said. "I watched that fire run a straight line up that ridge and lay down like it hit glass when it reached those trees. We lost 2 structures and a truck because the wind shifted around that spot, blew embers sideways instead of through it. Sometimes fire respects old boundaries. Sometimes it gets told to." I hiked back up with the kind of speed I usually reserve for incoming storms. The grove was darker now, shadows lengthening. The ring of stones looked less like an artifact and more like an open mouth. I did not dare step into it this time. I stood at the edge, unwrapped the token from my bandana, and hesitated only a second before tossing it so it landed with a dull click in the bare earth center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a breeze moved through the burned forest, carrying with it the dry, papery rattle of ash shifting. The black trunks around the grove seemed to lean inward, just slightly, as if nodding. Heat washed over my face, enough to sting my eyes, and then vanished like someone had opened a door to a cooler room. The next morning, when I went up with Blake, the grove was gone. Not gradually, not in a way that made sense. The green oval had been erased. The trees inside the boundary were as black and skeletal as the rest of the slope. The moss was gone, replaced by a thin layer of ash. The ring of stones lay collapsed, scattered as if something had kicked them outward from the center. In the bare earth where the ring had been, a perfect circle of soil was lighter than the surrounding ground, as if it had burned hotter than everything around it. We stood there a long time, saying nothing. "Guess your arrangements changed," I said finally, trying to keep my voice from shaking. Blake did not answer. His eyes stayed on the pale circle of dirt. "When how?" He did speak. His voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "Fire always takes its due," he said. "If something holds it back, it keeps a tab. Maybe you paid it off when you put that piece back. Maybe something else did." I left that assignment a few weeks later. Officially, it was just the end of my seasonal contract. Unofficially, I was grateful to trade that hillside for any other piece of ground. I still work outdoors. I still smell smoke sometimes. But now, when a fire line stops sharply around a patch of trees that should have gone up, I do not walk into the green without thinking very carefully about who or what might be standing there keeping count. I no longer pocket little souvenirs from strange places. Some things in Yellowstone have already been claimed, and when fire goes around them, it is not always an accident. My name is Carter, and I used to think a fire tower was the safest place you could be in Yellowstone. High above the trees, clear view in every direction, solid walls between you and whatever is moving in the dark below. That was before I learned that some things do not come from below. Some things come through the speakers. The tower assignment was supposed to be a reward. Quiet post, long stretches of solitude, a chance to prove I could handle responsibility without someone looking over my shoulder. I told everyone it was perfect for me. I liked my own company. I liked order. The tower was all about routine. Dawn weather log, mid-morning scan, hourly smoke checks, evening report, lights out. The first week felt almost peaceful. I memorized the ridge lines, learned where the thermal vents gave off just enough steam to look like a column at sunrise. I could tell which shadows were bison and which were stumps just by the way they shifted when the wind changed. At night, I read old case reports and listened to the low hum of the radio, comforted by the knowledge that if anything went wrong, someone could reach me with the press of a button. By week 2, the silence started to get inside my head. There is a kind of quiet in those towers that you do not get anywhere else. It is not really empty. The building creaks. The stove clicks as it cools. The metal railing sings a little when the gusts hit it just right. But beneath all of that, there is a wide, hollow stillness. Like the pause in a conversation when someone is about to say something important and has not decided how. The first time the voice came through, I was half asleep in the bunk with the radio on low at my elbow. I woke up to static. Not unusual. The weather had been unstable that day, and the repeater sometimes spit out interference when the clouds built too fast. I reached over to adjust the volume, more annoyed than anything. Then, under the static, I heard it. "Hello?" A woman's voice. Thin, shaky, not the clipped, practiced cadence of dispatch. "Is anyone there?" I sat up so fast my head hit the bunk rail. "Copy, this is Tower 4. Go ahead." My heart was already ticking up, running through possibilities. Lost hiker, injured camper, someone with a busted radio relay. Silence. The static hissed, rose, fell. "Please," the voice said. "I do not know where I am." They said someone would be listening. That line alone made the hair go up on my arms. We tell visitors a lot of things, but we do not tell them that. They said someone would be listening. That is not our language. That is not a script from any briefing I have ever given. I pushed the mic button again. "I hear you. Can you give me your name and any landmarks you can see? Any water, roads, lights?" Another pause. I could hear what might have been breathing, faint and uneven, like someone trying not to cry. "You know me, Carter," she whispered. "You know exactly where I am." The breath left my lungs in a rush. I did not remember telling her my name. I did not remember hearing it come over the line in her voice. But there it was, hanging between us in the narrow little tower. I had heard that voice before. Not in the park, not on a radio. In a different life. Sitting on the edge of a twin bed in an off-campus apartment, listening to someone explain why she could not keep trying to reach me if I never called back. Her name was Hannah, and it had been 4 years since we had spoken. I swallowed hard and tried to shove that memory back where it belonged. "I think you may have the wrong frequency," I said. My mouth was suddenly dry. "This is a restricted channel. Can you repeat your location?" The radio crackled, then went dead. I switched dials, checked with dispatch, even called another tower to see if anyone else had picked up stray chatter. Nothing. No one else had heard a thing. By morning, I had half convinced myself it had been a dream. The tower gets hot in the late afternoon, even in shoulder seasons, and it is easy to doze off without realizing it. I wrote it off as a mix of stress and loneliness, the brain replaying old tapes in a new setting. 2 nights later, the voice came back. This time I was fully awake, doing a last sweep with the binoculars before logging the midnight report. The radio was on, but quiet. No storms, no fire activity, just the occasional routine check-in from units down in the valleys. I had just set the glasses down when the speaker crackled like someone rubbing sandpaper over metal. "Brother," I leaned in. "Say again?" Static, then clearer. "Carter, do not hang up." My hand tightened on the mic. "Identify yourself." "You talked about this view," she said. "Remember? You said there was a tower where you could see forever. You said you wanted to bring me here." The world tilted for a moment. I had said something like that once, late at night. More ambition than plan. I had never actually followed through. "I think you have the wrong," I began. The radio popped loud enough to make me flinch. Her next words slid out in a way that made my stomach drop. "You left me," she said. "You do not get to leave me again." Lightning flickered far to the west, too distant to hear, just silent veins of light in the clouds. I checked the channel number. It was the tower's assigned frequency, the one that fed back to the rest of the park network. There was no private line, no way for someone to spoof a direct call. I did what training tells you to do when a caller seems disoriented. I brought it back to basics. "What can you see right now?" I asked. "Trees, water, a road, anything?" For the first time, I heard something other than her voice and the static. A low, constant roar like wind in a canyon or water pouring over rocks. Beneath it, faint clicking, almost rhythmic, like metal cooling. "Lights," she said, slowly. A ring of lights in the trees, and smoke. "You are not listening. You never listened." That last sentence was not about the park. It was about me. About old conversations in cluttered rooms, about voicemails I never returned. Whoever she was, wherever she was, she should not have known any of that. I felt sweat bead along my spine, even though the tower was cool with the window cracked. My own reflection hung in the glass in front of me, pale and uncertain in the overlapping faint glows from the instrument panel. Behind that ghost version of my face, the mountains were just darker shadows against the sky. "Stay where you are," I said. My voice sounded flat. "I am going to get your signal triangulated. I will keep this line open." She laughed then. Soft, humorless. It sounded exactly like it had the night she told me she was tired of waiting for me to show up. "You did not keep it open last time," she said. "You closed it. You hung up. Do you remember what you texted instead of calling?" I did. God help me, I did. 4 words, each one a flimsy excuse. I could see them in my mind, black on white. "I am working late." On the radio, the roar grew louder. The clicking picked up speed, in time with my heartbeat. "Where are you?" I whispered. "Look down," she said. I stepped to the window and pointed the flashlight straight down toward the clearing at the base of the tower. The beam cut through the dark in a narrow column. There was nothing there. Just the patch of scrub and gravel I had seen 100 times. My own footprints from earlier that day still faintly visible where I'd cleaned debris from the steps. No campfire ring, no tracks, no ring of lights. I swept the beam outward, across the tree line, the slope below, the small creek flashing back a dull reflection. Nothing. "You are not here," I said. "This is not real." The radio went quiet so fast, it felt like someone had yanked a cord. I stood there for a long time, listening to the tiny clicks of cooling metal and the blood beating in my ears. Eventually, I filed a short, vague note in the log about interference and possible unauthorized use of frequencies. I did not mention the words. I did not mention the way my own guilt had been thrown back at me in someone else's voice. Over the next month, the pattern continued. Not every night, never at the same time twice. Sometimes days would pass with nothing but weather alerts and routine dispatch traffic. Then, usually when the sky was heavy and the air tasted like impending rain, the static would thicken and her voice would slide through. She talked about things no one on the channels should have known. Inside jokes from years ago. The exact phrasing of a fight we had on a sidewalk 3 towns away from this park. The way my father's funeral smelled like damp wool and lilies. Always sandwiched between half-formed fragments about trees and smoke and lights. I sent in 3 separate maintenance requests for the radio. Techs hiked up, ran diagnostics, swapped out components. Every time, they told me the same thing. The equipment was in perfect working order. "You are probably catching spillover from civilians on a nearby band," one of them suggested. "Happens sometimes when the weather stacks weird." "Right," I said. I did not ask how a stranger on a random channel would know that I had once left a birthday dinner early by pretending to get an emergency call. The last night in the tower, the storm finally hit. Rain hammered the roof like handfuls of gravel. The wind shoved at the walls, making the whole structure shudder. Lightning turned the windows into momentary mirrors, flashing my own pale face back at me over and over. I had just finished logging the 3 a.m. weather check when the radio clicked on by itself. No static this time, no buildup. Just her voice, clear and close, like she was standing right behind me. "Come down," she said. "You cannot see it from up there. You never see anything from up there." Every survival instinct I had screamed no. You do not go wandering around a metal tower in a thunderstorm. You certainly do not climb down into trees that are swaying like they are trying to rip their roots free. I stayed where I was, knuckles white on the edge of the desk. "You left me alone," she said. The words overlapped with a thunderclap, but I heard them anyway. "You left me in the dark. Now you get to see how it feels. Where are you?" My voice broke. I did not care how it sounded. Thunder rolled again, closer. For a second, all the lights in the tower dimmed, then came back up. "Right under you," she whispered. I did not look down. Instead, I grabbed the binoculars and swung them in a slow, shaking arc across the tree line. In one flash of lightning, I saw them. Not lights, exactly, but pale shapes between the trunks, as if someone had hung lanterns too low to the ground, circling the clearing. They flickered once, twice, then vanished. The next flash showed nothing at all. When morning finally came, the storm moved on, and the radio fell silent. I climbed down on legs that barely wanted to hold me. At the base of the tower, the ground was soaked, muddy. littered with twigs and leaves. There were no footprints but mine. No signs of a camp, no scorch marks, nothing. I put in for a transfer the following week. Now, months later, I still wake up at 3:17 a.m., the time stamped on the last weather log from that tower. I keep a small handheld radio on the nightstand. It is turned off, batteries out. But sometimes I catch myself staring at it, waiting. I do not know if the voice was something in my own head, twisting lonely memories into something sharper, or if the park found a way to wear an old regret like a mask. I only know this. Whatever spoke to me used the one person I most wanted to forget as bait. And when you hear someone you failed calling for you from the middle of a place that does not forgive carelessness, it is very hard to trust that any voice on the other end of a line is really asking to be saved. My name is Nora, and this is the version of the report that never went into the system. The official paperwork for Case 27B reads like 100 other Yellowstone incidents. Solo male camper, mid-40s, left a designated site. Suffered a fall in rugged terrain. Remains found and recovered with signs of animal scavenging. Cause of death: blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. Contributing factors: poor judgment, disregard for posted warnings. End of story. Except it was not the end of the story. It was not even the beginning. We got the call on the second morning of a cold snap in early October. A party of 3 had checked out of a backcountry site one day late and hiked back to the trailhead without their 4th member. According to the group, he had gone off alone just before sunset to get better shots of the ridgeline and never came back. They searched for 2 hours and then decided to wait until morning. By then, a dusting of snow had fallen, and the trail back to camp was already softened by wind. When I asked why they had not contacted us sooner, the trip leader just shrugged and said, "He is stubborn. We thought he was playing some survival purist game." That stuck with me. The casual way people talk about another human being they have left behind in a canyon. We mobilized like we always do. Helicopter requested but delayed by weather. Ground teams divided into grid sectors. Coordinates of the last known point loaded into our GPS units. I was assigned as lead on one of the primary search lines. We hiked out under a low white sky that made the entire valley feel smaller, like the ceiling had dropped a few feet overnight. The first odd thing we found was his camera bag. It sat on a flat rock overlooking a steep drainage, centered almost perfectly, lenses capped, zipper half open. No snow on top, only around it, like it had been placed there after the wind eased. Beside it lay a pair of gloves, fingers aligned, not dropped or flung. People who are lost or panicking do not usually arrange their belongings in neat lines. They scatter them. I called it in, then clipped the bag to my pack. One of the newer rangers suggested maybe he had set it down to climb somewhere. We all looked at the rock face below. Sheer, slick with a thin glaze of ice, broken only by a few scraggly shrubs clinging to cracks. No chalk, no rope, no marks. It did not look like a place anyone would decide to scramble down without gear. We moved on. Later that afternoon, we reached a narrow saddle between 2 ridges, an area we knew was laced with old game trails and occasional unofficial spur paths that visitors liked to pretend were secret routes. As we checked junctions and called his name, I noticed one of the motion-triggered cameras strapped to a lodgepole pine was facing the wrong way. These cameras are workhorses. They watch animal corridors, record human traffic in sensitive areas, help us see patterns we would never catch with daylight patrols alone. We mount them carefully, angled to capture the maximum stretch of trail. This one had been turned to stare straight at the trunk of another tree a few feet away. No view of the trail at all. Just bark. I flagged it for later review, straightened it to the correct angle, and tried to ignore the way the plastic casing felt slightly warm under my fingers in the cold air. That night, we made camp in a clearing just below tree line, close enough to the last known point that we could be back there within an hour at first light. Snow fell in light, dry flakes, more like dust than real weather. The temperature dropped hard once the sun checked out. We ate quickly, wrote our notes by headlamp, and zipped ourselves into sleeping bags that never quite seem as warm as the brochure promises. Sometime past midnight, something started circling the camp. It was not unusual to have wildlife move through at night. You get used to hearing elk hooves, the soft pad of coyotes, the occasional distant bellow of a frustrated bison. This was different. Whatever it was stayed just beyond the edge of our light, pacing deliberately. No clear footfalls, just a faint crunch, then a pause, then a faint crunch again, always behind whichever tent the current watcher was not facing. We took turns sitting up, watching, calling out softly, "Hey bear, keep moving." Standard routine. No eye shine flashed back at us. No huffing breath, no snapping branches. Just that slow, assessing movement. At one point, one of the guys swore he heard breathing, long and controlled, near his tent wall. But when he opened the flap, there was only cold air and drifting snow. By morning, the snow around camp looked undisturbed. No clear tracks, only minor shifts in the drifts that could have been wind. We packed up feeling more tired than we wanted to admit and pushed into steeper ground. We found him on the second day. It was one of the volunteers who spotted a scrap of bright blue fabric down in a ravine, snagged on low brush. We fanned out along the rim until we could see the full shape. A body lying on its back against a slope of rocks, arms tucked close as if asleep. The snow around him was oddly clean. No scatter, no struggle marks, just a soft halo where flakes had landed and melted, landed and melted. Protocol took over. We marked the site, photographed everything, and carefully made our way down. Up close, the scene made less sense. If he had fallen from above, there should have been some sign of impact in the snow or the soil. A trench where his body had slid, a bruised line of disturbed vegetation. Instead, he looked as if he had been placed there. There were no scrapes on his hands, no torn fingernails, nothing to indicate a desperate attempt to stop his descent. His backpack was missing. So were his boots. His socks were clean. No blood, no mud, no thorns jammed into the fabric. Every identifying item you would expect to find on a body in the backcountry, wallet, keys, phone, permit copy, was gone. Except for the ring. His wedding band had been pushed deep into his mouth. Not lodged accidentally, not caught on broken teeth. Placed. I saw the glint of metal when we checked for airway obstructions, shone my light in, and felt my stomach drop. I will never forget the image of that circle of gold resting against his tongue. We withdrew, documented, did everything the book demands. The medical examiner would later tell us the primary trauma was consistent with a fall, that the injuries matched an impact from a certain height onto rock. What the paperwork did not say was that the fractures did not line up with any obvious drop above the ravine. The slopes were wrong. The angles were wrong. There was nowhere clean for a body to have launched from and landed where he did without leaving more evidence behind. As we secured the area, I noticed tracks leading away from the scene. Not boot prints, not animal paw marks. Bare impressions, elongated, spaced a little too far apart, like someone walking on the balls of their feet. They moved up the ravine wall, and into a stand of trees, then faded where the snow had drifted deeper. I called another ranger over, heart thudding. "Do you see that?" He squinted, frowned, and shook his head. "Snow melt, shadows. Do not start seeing ghosts, Nora." I stopped talking about the prints. Back at headquarters, we pulled the trail camera images from the area leading up to the ravine. In the hours before the man vanished, the cameras showed normal traffic, his group hiking together, then splitting when he veered off toward a side ridge with his camera bag. After that, the footage turned wrong. On 3 separate cameras, the angles shifted within a 10-minute window. Each one had been rotated away from the trail to face blank trees or open sky. The last image, clearly capturing him, showed a figure standing a few yards behind him on the ridge. Tall, still, head tilted. No face, just a darker shape within the dark of the trees. The other rangers shrugged it off as a trick of contrast. A branch, a shadow, a coat tossed over a stump. I wanted to believe them. I tried. I wrote my report that night, sitting under the harsh fluorescent hum of the office, hands stiff from cold and fatigue. I listed the facts: time, location, weather, group details, recovery notes. When I got to the part about the ring, I hesitated. That detail went in. You cannot hide something like that in the official record. But the bear prints? The feeling of something pacing our camp? The turned cameras and the shape on the ridge? Those stayed out. Internal Affairs reviewed the case a week later. Standard when a body comes back with unanswered questions. I sat across from a man with a neutral tie and neutral eyes while he asked me whether I felt there had been any negligence on the part of the park in posting warnings, whether our response time had been adequate, whether we had fully educated the group on off-trail risks. I answered everything honestly and watched him type. The little cursor blinking across words like contributing factors and visitor behavior. At the end, he closed his laptop and said, "Is there anything else you think we should know, Officer Johnston?" For a heartbeat, I considered telling him everything. The token-like arrangement of the belongings, the sense of being watched in the dark. The ring pushed where it did not belong, like a message written in flesh instead of ink. The prints that did not match any species chart on our wall. Instead, I heard myself say, "No, that is all." He nodded, satisfied, and moved on to the next file. Here's the part that keeps me up. A week after we closed 27B, I woke to find a set of faint, elongated impressions in the light frost outside my cabin. Not clear enough to photograph, not distinct enough to prove anything. Just a suggestion of weight having passed by my door. The spacing eerily similar to what I had seen in the ravine. I told myself it was runoff. Ice melt patterns, my own imagination knitting shadows into footsteps. I keep telling myself that every time I walk past the wall of missing persons flyers and see how many of them list left established trail as a last known action. The park likes clean stories. A bad decision, a simple fall, animals doing what animals do. We tuck the rough edges away so visitors will keep coming, so they will not see how much we do not understand. I used to believe in that simplification. It made the job easier. Now, when I lead searches, I pay attention to the spaces where cameras go blind for no good reason, to the places where people vanish without leaving the kind of trace physics says they should. I log what I am supposed to log and leave the rest in a separate ledger in my head. Because I have started to suspect there is something out here that knows our roots, our blind spots, our protocols. Something that understands how to stage a scene to look like carelessness and gravity. Something that walks just outside the angles our equipment can see. And whatever it is getting better at arranging bodies to match our expectations. Right up until you notice the one small detail that does not fit, like a ring pushed where no human hand would ever put it by accident. My name is Aiden, and there is one winter patrol in Yellowstone that I pretend never happened. On the calendar, it is just another block of shifts I worked 2 seasons ago. In my head, it is a day that refused to stay in its own place. A loop that folded over itself until I was not sure which version of me was leaving which set of tracks. Winter work was the only part of this job I truly loved. The crowds are gone, the animals keep their distance, and the park finally feels like the quiet, dangerous thing it really is. I knew my snowmobile routes by heart. Closed roads to check for downed trees, shuttered cabins to inspect for damage, radio repeaters to brush free of ice. It was all schedule and routine, the kind of predictable structure that calms a brain like mine. That morning started like every other. The sky was a hard, bright blue, the kind that makes the snow look almost metallic. The air cut at any exposed skin, but there was barely a breeze, and my machine fired up on the first try. I signed out at the station, noted my route on the board, and told the others I would be back before dark. The plan was simple. Run north on an old service road, swing past 2 backcountry patrol cabins, then cut east across an open meadow to check a weather station before looping home. I had done it so many times that my hands knew when to turn before my eyes saw the markers. About an hour in, somewhere between the first cabin and the meadow, I noticed the tracks. A set of boot prints crossed my snowmobile trail at a sharp angle, heading downslope toward a stand of trees. Fresh, crisp edges. No wind softening yet. Human, medium size, standard pattern from park-issue winter boots. That alone was odd enough. No one else had signed out on this route, and no public access should have been anywhere near here with the gates closed. I slowed, then stopped. The engine idled under me, a low, steady vibration. I slipped off, let the silence settle around me, and crouched to study the prints. They were not over my track. They cut it. That meant whoever made them had been out here before me. I followed them a short way, just far enough to see that they continued in a straight line to the tree line, then vanished into deeper drifts where the shadows swallowed detail. I weighed the options. Training said do not follow unknown tracks off-route alone in deep winter unless there are signs of distress. The prints were neat, regular, no staggering or dragging. Whoever it was, they were moving with purpose. I backed away, climbed onto the sled, and made a note to radio in from the first cabin. The cabin sat in a small cluster of trees, its roof loaded with snow, windows dark. I parked, knocked ice from my boots, and went through the usual checklist. Door secure, no sign of forced entry, chimney intact, no wildlife damage. Inside, my breath smoked in the still air as I checked the logbook on the table. A simple spiral notebook where rangers sign in and occasionally jot notes for each other. The last entry was from 3 weeks earlier, a familiar scrawl from one of the guys on swing shift. Below it, in handwriting that looked disturbingly like mine, was today's date and my name. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the curve of the letters, the way the A hooked a little too far right, the way the D leaned. It was my style. But I had not been here yet today. I had just opened the door. Cold slid under my jacket in a thin, mean line. I checked the edges of the page. The ink was dry, no smears, no indentation from writing over something else. I flipped back a few sheets, half expecting to find other phantom versions of my name, but everything else looked normal. Glove ink transfer, I muttered to myself. Old note, new date in your head. The explanation sounded weak, even to me. I wrote another entry beneath the strange one, pressing the pen harder than necessary. Patrol A. Campbell, Cabin 12, 10:42 hours. Inspection clear. The letters looked the same. Back outside, the boot prints from earlier nagged at me. I tried raising dispatch on the radio, but a wall of static answered. It happens in those valleys sometimes, the signal bouncing wrong. I told myself I would call from higher ground and pushed on toward the meadow. That was where everything started to slide sideways. The meadow was a broad, open stretch of white that I had crossed hundreds of times. A single dead tree stood near the center like a marker, its bark stripped by age and weather. On clear days, you could see your own tracks trailing behind you all the way back to the tree line. Today, as I came out of the woods, I saw 3 sets of tracks. One was the line I was making now, a clean curve from the trees. Crossing it at an angle was a second snowmobile track, older, edges softened, but still readable, heading toward the dead tree from the opposite side. And weaving between them was a set of boot prints. My boot prints. The exact tread, the exact size, that same slight toe out on the left foot I had seen in the unknown trail earlier. I stopped so abruptly the sled fishtailed. My breath fogged the visor. I lifted it, letting the cold slap my face awake. "This is not funny," I said to the empty air. No one answered. The engine's idle suddenly sounded too loud. I killed it. The silence that dropped into its place was so complete, it made my ears ring. I swung off and walked to where the 3 paths met. The boot prints from the west crossed the older snowmobile line, then continued toward the tree. The ones I was making now marched up beside them like they were trying to match pace. I followed both sets toward the center of the meadow. The tree up close was bigger than it looked from the edge. Its dead branches twisted against the white sky. At its base, in the shallow, wind-carved hollow around the trunk, the tracks overlapped in a muddled knot. Then stopped. No circle back, no wandering off, no sign of anyone kneeling or sitting. Just an abrupt end where step became nothing. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the featureless snow. My own pulse thudded behind my eyes. You learn to read tracks out here like another language. This looked like a sentence with no period. It simply trailed off midair. My radio crackled then, sudden and sharp in the quiet. I grabbed for it like a lifeline. "Aiden, what is your position?" The voice was my supervisor's, but distorted, as if coming from very far away. "Crossing Meadow 12, I replied. "Cabin check complete. I am seeing odd sign, possible multiple passes on this route. Have we had any unlogged patrols today?" Static hissed back. Then, faintly, "You already checked that meadow. Do not loop it again. Head east and come in." My skin went cold under all the layers. "Say again?" "This is my first pass through this sector today." No answer. Just a burst of garbled noise and a high, whining squeal that made me pull the handset away from my ear. Enough, I thought. I was tired. I was letting a few weird coincidences snowball into paranoia, and I was wasting daylight arguing with a malfunctioning radio in a haunted-feeling field. I walked back to the sled, forcing myself not to look over my shoulder at the dead tree. The air around it felt thicker, like the space it occupied was heavier than the rest of the meadow. The engine finally caught on the third try, I swung the sled in a wide arc, planning to cut toward the weather station and then home. But as I crested a small rise on the eastern edge of the meadow, my stomach dropped. The same meadow stretched out before me again. The same dead tree. The same tangle of overlapping tracks at its base. For a moment, some part of my brain refused to believe what my eyes were seeing. I checked the compass mounted on the handlebars. The needle pointed steadily north. I checked the handheld GPS clipped to my chest. The little arrow marking my position blinked. On the western edge of Meadow 12, exactly where I had been 5 minutes earlier. I turned the sled in a slow circle, watching the GPS map rotate. No matter which way I faced, the position marker did not move. Panic presses on you differently in the cold. It is heavy, sluggish, like trying to run through waist-deep snow. Every instinct screamed at me to keep going, to push harder in some direction, any direction, until something changed. Another part of me, the part that has sat through too many SAR debriefs, whispered that moving fast when you do not understand what is happening is how people die. I shut off the engine. The sudden silence felt like the realest thing I had touched all day. I stood there, one hand on the handlebars, and listened. No wind, no distant crack of branches. Just a faint, almost subsonic hum I thought at first was in my own ears, until I realized it was coming from under my boots. The snow beneath me vibrated, just barely, like something far below the surface was turning. "Okay," I said aloud, voice shaking. "I get it. I am not going to chase it." I did not try to ride out again. Instead, I took 3 careful steps away from the sled. Then 3 more, always facing the same direction, counting my breaths. At 10 paces, I stopped and looked back. The sled was where I had left it. The tree was still ahead, but further now, the tangle of tracks at its base a little smaller. Behind me, for the first time that day, there was untouched snow. One clean line of my footprints marching back toward the machine. The humming underfoot lessened. I walked back slowly, resisting the urge to glance around for other versions of myself, staggering across other years' worth of patrols. When I started the engine again, the GPS blipped once, then caught up, the little arrow jumping to a new position, eastern edge of Meadow 12. Right where it should have been all along. The rest of the route home passed without incident. The radios behaved. The cabins ahead were as ordinary as weathered wood and cold stoves can be. Back at the station, I did not mention the duplicate log entry or the looping meadow. I wrote a bland report about minor interference and recommended a calibration check for the GPS. My supervisor signed off without comment. A week later, curiosity finally overrode common sense. I pulled the Cabin 12 logbook from storage and flipped to the page for that day. There was only one entry in my handwriting. The strange duplicate had vanished, if it had ever been there at all. Sometimes, on nights when the wind rattles the windows just right, I dream of that meadow. In the dream, there are not just 3 sets of tracks, but dozens, crisscrossing in layers of ice and powder, all with my stride, my boots, my small hesitations. They circle that dead tree like rings in a cut trunk. Each one a year I almost did not make it back. I still run winter patrols, I still cross Meadow 12. But I do it once, straight through, no detours, no chasing oddities in the snow. If the GPS glitches or the radio coughs up a familiar voice telling me to go around again, I kill the engine and wait. Out here, time is just another terrain feature. Most days it behaves, Some days it folds. And on those days, the only smart move might be to stand still and hope the loop closes without taking you with it. My name is Haley, and the first time I realized something in Yellowstone was learning how to wear my face. I was sitting in a training room watching myself on a television I did not remember standing in front of. On the screen, I was in full uniform, smiling that professional ranger smile, delivering the standard front country safety orientation. I knew the script by heart. I had given that talk 100 times. But halfway through the video, I said something I had never said in my life. If you decide to ignore the closure signs on Cascade Ridge, the version of me on the screen warned, understand that we may not be able to bring you back in one piece. The room laughed politely. My supervisor chuckled and said something about vivid phrasing, Bennett. I sat there with my hands locked together in my lap, staring at my own lips, shaping words I had no memory of choosing. We did not have a closure on Cascade Ridge when that video was filmed. We did not have a closure there at all until 3 weeks later, after the day I lost. It was supposed to be a simple off-season assignment. Post new warning placards along a trail that was being shut down for rockfall and unstable ground. No crowds, no chatter, just me, my pack, a staple gun, and a stack of bright yellow signs telling people to stay away from places they could get themselves killed. I remember being almost excited for the quiet. Front country work is noise and questions and breaking up arguments between tourists who think the rules apply to everyone but them. A solo hike with a clear task felt like a day off that someone decided to pay me for. The morning was overcast, the sky a flat sheet of white that made the snow patches glow and the trees look like charcoal sketches. I parked at the empty lot, signed out on the log, and started up the trail. The first odd thing happened less than a mile in. A group of 3 hikers came around a bend toward me, heading down. Their clothes did not match any of the usual commercial tour outfits. No matching vests or branded hats. Just neutral layers, faces I could not quite focus on. As they drew level, one of them, a woman with dark hair half tucked under a beanie, smiled and said, "Morning, Hales." Only my family calls me that, not co-workers, not visitors. I opened my mouth to ask if we knew each other, but the 3 of them were already past, moving in oddly synchronized steps, boots landing almost at the same instant, like a single creature with 3 bodies. When I turned to call after them, they were further down the trail than they should have been for the few seconds I had my back turned. No crunch of accelerated footsteps, no slipping or sliding, just distance that did not make sense. I told myself I was imagining it, focused on the task. At each junction, I checked the map, chose a tree, and posted a sign. Trail closed beyond this point. Unstable conditions. The routine settled my nerves. Measure, level, staple, move on. Somewhere around the 3rd sign, I noticed my shadow. At first, it was just a passing flicker at the edge of my vision, the kind of thing you blame on shifting clouds. But then the pattern became clear. When I lifted my arm to check the time, the shadow's arm rose a beat late. When I pushed hair back under my beanie, the dark shape on the ground mimicked the movement just behind. The lag was small, half a second at most. But once I saw it, I could not stop seeing it. I tested it, wiggled my fingers, tilted my head. Each time, the shadow followed on a slight delay, like a video and audio track knocked just out of sync. The light was diffuse enough that there should not have been a sharp shadow at all. I kept moving. The air felt thicker, like I was walking through water. The forest sounds, the wind, the occasional distant jay, faded to a muffle. At the next planned posting point, I rounded a curve and froze. There, nailed neatly to a tree beside the trail, was one of our closure signs. Same wording, same bright yellow background, same metal staples pinning it to the bark. At the bottom, in black permanent marker, were my initials and that day's date. I checked the stack in my hand. Every sign was still there, none missing. My marker was capped in my pocket. The signature on the posted sign was my handwriting. Same looping H, same hurried slant on the B. My heart started to pound in that sick, low way, like it was trying to hide behind my ribs. I peeled one glove off with my teeth and ran bare fingers along the edge of the sign. The paper was dry. No condensation, no smear. It had not just been tacked there in the last 2 minutes. It had been there long enough to settle into the bark. I backed away, turned, and looked down the trail. The snow behind me lay mostly undisturbed, save for my own footprints and the lingering, softened marks of the earlier group. No extra trail led past where I stood. No churned patch where someone could have circled around me unseen. "Okay," I said out loud, because the silence was starting to press on me. "This is not funny." The trees did not answer. My radio, clipped to my shoulder, remained a dull, black rectangle. I kept going. The trail narrowed, cutting into a steep hillside. The drop-off to my right slid down into a tangle of brush and boulders. Ahead, I could see the overlook where we planned to post the final, largest sign. Beyond that, the closure would be total. As I approached, the sense of wrongness coiled tighter. The air tasted metallic, like I had put my tongue on a battery. My teeth ached. The closer I got to the overlook, the more the world seemed to lag around the edges. Movements felt delayed, like the air was taking an extra second to get out of my way. There is a metal railing at that overlook, a simple waist-high barrier painted Park Service brown. I have leaned on it 100 times, watched the water cut through the rocks below, answered endless questions about how deep the canyon is. I have also seen what happens when someone leans too far. As I stepped into the clearing, I saw myself standing at that railing. She, me, had both hands resting on the top bar, head tilted slightly as she looked down. Same uniform, same beanie, same flyaway hair escaping at the nape of the neck. For a moment I thought there must be a mirror, some weird trick of glass. But there was nothing reflective in front of her except open air and distance. My stomach lurched. I blinked hard. When my eyes reopened, the space beside the railing was empty. No double, just the scuffed dirt where countless feet had stood. In the faint reflection on the metal rail itself, though, I could still see two figures. One where I stood, one a half step closer to the edge. My shadow stretched long on the ground behind me. It did not line up with my feet. Footsteps crunched on the trail just behind my left shoulder. Slow, deliberate, in time with the slight delay of the shadow. I did not turn around. "Posting final closure sign at Overlook 3, I said into the radio, though I had not touched the pit button. My voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere else, half a second off from the movement of my lips. "Conditions unstable. Recommend full seasonal closure." Static answered. Beneath it, very softly, another voice said, "Do not turn around, Haley." It sounded like me. The urge to look was almost overwhelming. Every instinct screamed to identify whatever was at my back. But another instinct, older and less verbal, told me that recognizing the wrong thing as myself was a line I did not want to cross. I took the sign with shaking hands and stapled it to the post at the trail's end. Each thunk of the stapler sounded like it echoed too long. When I finished, I stepped backward toward the trail, never taking my eyes off the spot where my double had stood. The footsteps behind me matched. Always a fraction behind, always landing just where mine had been. When I reached the bend that would take me out of sight of the overlook, I finally risked a glance over my shoulder. No one was there. No second set of prints appeared in the snow. But my shadow, stretched along the curve of the hill, still moved wrong, lagging, catching up, like something had tried the timing once and not quite perfected it. The hike down blurred. One minute I was on the ridge, the next I was signing back in at the trailhead, pen scratching my name on the sheet. The clock on the board said it was nearly dark. My watch said I had been gone less than 3 hours. The route should have taken at least 5 with the posting work. My supervisor frowned when I came in. "You all right? You were back early, and you did not have to redo the ridge signs. They looked fine after the rockfall." "Redo?" I asked. My voice sounded hollow to my own ears. He flipped through a clipboard. "The maintenance note from last week. You signed off on that whole section already. We just needed a confirmation. You sure you are getting enough sleep?" Later, in the break room, they queued up an internal video to show some new staff how not to talk to visitors. There I was on the screen again, at Cascade Ridge, gesturing at a gleaming new closure sign, telling the camera that beyond that point, the park did not belong to people anymore. That if they stepped past, something else might decide to step in. I have no memory of that recording session. None. Now, when I walk past mirrors in the visitor center, I keep my eyes front. I do not catch my reflection in windows after dark. I avoid solo assignments on that ridge, and when I have to post a new sign, I bring someone with me, if only as a witness that there was just one of me up there. Because here's the part I cannot shake. Whatever out there tried on my mannerisms, my face, my voice, it was getting better at it, smoother, closer to perfect. And if there is one thing scarier than something that wants to hurt you, it is something that wants to replace you so completely that no one can tell which version of you came back down the trail. My name is Nolan, and this is the story I never put in my resignation letter. On paper, I left the Yellowstone for family reasons after 10 years working wildlife in Lamar Valley. The truth is that my last night patrol out there convinced me that something else is hunting the same ground we pretend to manage. And it is better at the job than we are. Lamar at dusk is the kind of beautiful that makes your chest hurt. The light goes copper, the hills roll out in layered shadows, and the wolves start to move. People come from all over the world just to stand by the roadside with spotting scopes, hoping for a glimpse. My job was to protect those people from their own bad decisions, and to protect the animals from them too. That night, late in the season, the valley felt almost empty. The bigger crowds had thinned, the air had that sharp, metallic edge that says winter is testing the locks. I was alone in the truck, making one last pass to check for illegal campers and spotlight for poachers. A storm front was stacking along the horizon, but the stars above Lamar were still clear, bright enough that the snow patches glowed like ghost pools. For the first hour, it was routine. A pair of elk near the river, a lone bison lumbering along the shoulder, a fox that stared at my headlights, like it had never seen a vehicle before. I wrote a warning for a van parked too close to a pullout and moved on, drinking coffee that tasted like burned plastic just to keep my hands busy. Then I saw the carcass. It was just off the road, half hidden in a patch of willows. An elk, big and healthy looking even in death, laid out on its side with the chest cavity neatly opened. Not torn, not ripped, opened. The cut line along the hide was too clean and too straight for wolf work. No ragged edges, no tufts of hair scattered around. The organs that should have spilled were gone. The legs were folded almost tidily underneath, like someone had posed it. My first thought was poachers. It fit the pattern. Take the prime cuts, leave the rest for scavengers. Get out before anyone notices. But the usual signs were missing. No drag marks, no tire tracks nearby. No footprints in the soft ground except a few deer trails and my own prints from when I stepped out to check. I radioed in a possible illegal kill and took photos from every angle, the flash popping harsh white against the dark. The stillness around that carcass felt wrong. Usually, even a fresh kill has some life around it. Ravens watching from branches, a distant coyote listening for an opening. This one was silent. The only sound was the slow tick of my cooling engine. I was back in the truck, logging the coordinates, when I heard the first howl. I know wolf voices. 10 years out here, and you could wake me from a dead sleep. And I could tell you the difference between a contact call and a rally cry, between a pup complaining and an adult warning. This sound did not fit any of those. It started low, almost like a moan, then climbed, not just in pitch, but in number. One voice became several, then many, all hitting the same note, all rising and falling in perfect synchronization. The hair on my arms lifted. Wolves do chorus, but not like that. They overlap, weave in and out, individuals threading through the group. This was one sound split into pieces. I killed the engine and stepped out, letting the cold close over me. The howling was coming from deeper in the valley, beyond the line of willows, somewhere along the slope that leads up toward the northern hills. I grabbed my spotlight and swept it across the dark, looking for eyeshine. Nothing. Not a single glint. The howls circled, the direction shifting without any accompanying movement in the brush. One moment they sounded like they were above me, the next like they were behind, then suddenly way out across the flats. No crunch of paws on snow, no snapping twigs. Just that eerie, perfectly timed call, like a recording played through invisible speakers. "Knock it off," I muttered, more to myself than anything, and swung the spotlight again. This time it caught something. Two sets of tracks intersected the narrow trail that led away from the carcass. One set was exactly what I expected from a big canid. Deep paw prints, nails evident, stride easy and confident. The other set made my throat go dry. Boot prints. Human, heavy treads, similar to the kind you see on serious backcountry gear. They walked right alongside the paw prints, matching their length and spacing so closely it looked like a single creature with two different feet. Whoever it was had not been dragged. There were no stumbles, no signs of someone being forced. Just two beings moving as one. I followed them with the beam, watching as they veered off the game trail and up toward a darker line of trees. About 30 yards out, the human prints stopped. The paws continued alone. Back in the truck, my radio crackled with a brief, broken burst of static, like someone had almost keyed the mic and thought better of it. I called in the tracks, asked if any patrols were in the area on foot. "Negative," came the answer. I was the only unit in that sector. "As long as they are not shooting, leave it," my supervisor said. "We will sweep it in daylight." Leaving it was the last thing I wanted to do. But I also knew what happens to rangers who chase shadows off the road at night in rough country. They end up as names on plaques with small wreaths in spring. I drove on. The howling faded as I put distance between myself and the carcass. But the valley did not feel any less watched. Every time my hand drifted toward the spotlight, I had the sense that something out there was waiting for me to swing that beam a little too far off the road, to lean a little too far into the dark. An hour later, heading back toward the station, I saw the fire. It was on a rise above the valley floor, in a gap between two stands of trees. A small, contained flame, too steady and orange to be anything but human-made. No campsites were permitted there. No work crews were scheduled. I cursed under my breath and turned off onto the narrow dirt track that curved up toward it. As I got closer, the fire shrank, then vanished altogether, like someone had dropped a blanket over it. I killed my headlights and rolled the last few yards on idle, heart thumping so loud it felt like it was shaking the steering column. The clearing at the top was empty. No tent, no coals, no smoke. Just a circle of stones in the snow, blackened on the inside, as if they had hosted many fires, but none tonight. In the center of the ring lay a pile of bones, not random, arranged. Long elk bones interspersed with shorter ones, all laid in a rough wheel pattern. Spokes pointing outward. I stepped out slowly, every sense straining. The cold bit straight through my uniform. My breath hung in front of me in quick, shallow puffs. There was a sound then from the tree line, not the howl this time. A single, low chuckle, half human, half something else. I spun, raising the light. The beam caught eyes. Dozens of them at varying heights just inside the shadowed trees. Wolf eyes, reflecting green-white. But behind them, taller, further back, two more points of reflection, higher than any man I had ever met could stand. The shape they marked was wrong. Too long in the shoulder, too narrow in the waist. Hanging from that tall, dark outline was an elk skull. I knew that even before the spotlight picked out the curve of the antlers. Fresh blood slicked the bone, dripping slowly onto something pale at its feet. A mask my mind supplied, because the other option was to accept that something had grown into that shape. The wolves did not move. They ringed the figure like obedient dogs waiting for a hand signal. The air hummed with their held-back energy. The skull-headed thing turned slightly, just enough that the empty sockets faced me. When it spoke, the voice was not loud, but the words carried clean all the same. "You should not be here alone, Nolan." Hearing my name from that hollow, bone-echoing rasp snapped me out of whatever root-deep trance had pinned me. I stumbled backward, almost went down in the snow, and scrambled for the truck. I did not remember starting the engine. I did not remember turning the wheel. One moment I was on my knees in the cold. The next, the valley was unraveling in my rearview mirror, my tires chewing gravel as I barreled back toward the main road with my lights off and my heart hammering hard enough to blur my vision. When I finally dared to look back, there was nothing on the rise. No fire. No eyes. Just the dim outline of trees against the sky. By the time I reached the station, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely fill out the nightly log. I wrote down the carcass. I wrote down the suspicious cuts and the human tracks. I wrote unidentified figures at a distance and recommended increased patrols. I did not mention the mask. I did not mention my name, spoken by something that owned a ring of wolves. 2 days later, we sent a team to check the site in daylight. The elk carcass was gone, every scrap of it. Not dragged, not scattered, gone. The circle of stones on the rise was still there, but the bones had been reduced to powder, sifted smooth, as if someone had taken great care to erase the pattern. One of the older rangers pulled me aside afterward. His face was lines and windburn, eyes as tired as mine felt. "You saw it, did you not?" he asked quietly. "Or something like it." I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Finally, I said, "I saw enough." He nodded, like that was all the confirmation he needed. You will not find that in any manual. But the stories are older than the park. People who wear heads that are not theirs. People who call the predators instead of fearing them. You run when you see that. You did right. I handed in my resignation a month later. I told them I was burned out, that the long nights had gotten to me, that I wanted to be closer to home. They shook my hand, threw me a cake in the break room, told me I would be back someday because guys like me never really leave the field. Maybe they are right. Maybe I will miss the valley enough that the memories loosen their grip. But every time I hear a wolf documentary on TV, every time a nature app on my phone plays a recorded howl, part of me waits for the moment when the sound slips, just a fraction, into that too perfect chorus I heard in Lamar. The one that was not calling to other wolves at all. It was calling to something that stands a little too tall, wears an elk's face like a crown, and knows my name. Good evening, all, and welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight, we follow the ribbons of asphalt that cut through America's darkest hours, where 18-wheelers crawl through the void between distant cities. The air carries diesel exhaust and something else, a metallic taste that clings to the back of your throat as you count mile markers that seem to repeat themselves. These accounts have been whispered across CB frequencies for decades, shared in hushed tones at truck stops where fluorescent lights flicker against windows black as oil. Veteran drivers speak of routes that shouldn't exist, of cargo manifests that change while you're not looking, and of passengers who climb aboard at rest stops that have been abandoned for years. The stories you're about to hear were transcribed from encrypted dispatcher recordings and the personal logbooks of drivers who simply vanished from their scheduled routes. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet horrors we share, stay with us. Subscribe to Buried Files and keep the night close. Danny Kowalski had been running the I-80 corridor for 15 years, and he knew every truck stop, every way station, every stretch of road where the state troopers like to hide between the overpasses. His Peterbilt 379 hummed steadily through the Nebraska darkness, the CB radio crackling with the occasional exchange between drivers still awake in the small hours. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:47 a.m., and he was making good time on his run from Sacramento to Chicago. The load was routine, automotive parts for a Ford dealership, nothing unusual. The paperwork had been clean, the pickup smooth, and the dispatcher had given him a tight but manageable schedule. Danny preferred these overnight hauls. Less traffic, fewer four-wheelers cutting him off, and the hypnotic rhythm of the road helped him think. Tonight, though, something felt different. It started with the radio. At first, Danny thought it was just interference, a crackling sound that seemed to drift in and out of the CB channels. But as he adjusted the squelch and swept through the frequencies, the sound followed him. It wasn't static exactly, more like distant voices speaking in a language he couldn't identify. The words, if they were words, seemed to overlap and echo, creating a strange harmony that made his teeth ache. He turned the radio off. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. Danny rolled down his window slightly, letting the cold Nebraska air rush into the cab. The familiar sounds of the highway, the whistle of wind past his mirrors, the steady thrum of his diesel engine, the rhythmic thump of tire treads on asphalt, all seemed muted, as if the night itself had thickened around him. Mile marker 237 passed on his right, illuminated briefly in his headlights before disappearing into the darkness behind him. Danny had passed this marker countless times over the years, but tonight it looked different somehow. The numbers seemed to glow with their own pale light, and for just a moment, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing beside it. When he checked his side mirror, there was nothing there. He reached for his thermos of coffee, but his hand stopped halfway. In the reflection of the passenger window, he could see another truck following him. Its headlights were dim, yellowed, like the eyes of something old and tired. Danny checked his mirrors again. The road behind him was empty. But the reflection in the window remained, showing that phantom truck maintaining a steady distance behind his trailer. Danny's mouth went dry. He'd heard stories like this before, whispered between drivers at truck stops in the early morning hours. Ghost trucks, phantom loads, highways that led nowhere. He'd always assumed they were just road fatigue talking, the product of too many hours behind the wheel and too much caffeine. Now he wasn't so sure. The exit ramp for Kearney appeared ahead, and Danny considered pulling off. He could grab a shower, maybe catch a few hours of sleep in his sleeper berth, wait for dawn before continuing. But his delivery was time-sensitive, and he was already cutting it close. He kept driving. As he passed the exit, the speedometer needle began to flutter. Danny frowned and tapped the gauge, but the needle continued to dance between 65 and 75, even though he could feel the truck maintaining a steady pace. The engine temperature looked normal. Oil pressure was fine, but something was definitely wrong. Mile marker 238 should have been next. But when the next marker appeared in his headlights, it read 237 again. Danny felt his heart rate spike. He'd been driving this route for years. He knew these mile markers by heart. There was no way he'd somehow turned around or taken a wrong turn. I-80 was a straight shot through this part of Nebraska, with no complex interchanges or confusing ramps. Yet there it was, mile marker 237, looking exactly as it had before. He keyed his CB radio, despite having turned it off earlier. The unit was dead, no power light, no static. Danny was sure he hadn't touched the power switch, but he reached over and turned it back on anyway. Instead of the usual channels, he heard only that strange, overlapping voice pattern from before. But clearer now. The sounds weren't in any language he recognized, but they seemed almost familiar, like half-remembered words from a dream. The phantom truck in his window reflection was closer now. Danny could make out details that shouldn't have been visible in the darkness. Rust patterns on the hood, a cracked windshield, and behind the wheel, a silhouette that didn't quite look right. The figure's head was tilted at an angle that suggested something broken, and its hands on the steering wheel appeared to have too many fingers. Danny pressed harder on the accelerator, but his speed remained constant. The engine responded normally, revs climbing as expected, but the landscape outside continued to scroll past at the same steady pace. It was as if the road itself was moving beneath him, carrying him forward regardless of his input. Mile marker 237 appeared again, and again. Each time, the marker looked slightly different. The first time, it had been a standard green highway sign. The second time, It seemed older, more weathered. Now it appeared to be made of wood, like something from a much earlier era of road construction. The numbers were carved deep into the surface, and they seemed to shift and blur when he wasn't looking directly at them. The air inside the cab was growing colder, despite the heater running at full blast. Danny could see his breath now. Little puffs of vapor that hung in the air longer than they should have. The windshield began to fog from the inside, and when he reached over to wipe it clear, his hand left a streak that revealed something impossible. The landscape outside wasn't Nebraska anymore. Through the clear patch on the windshield, Danny could see rolling hills covered in twisted trees that looked more like gnarled hands reaching toward the sky. The asphalt beneath his wheels had become something else. Rough cobblestones that clicked and rattled under his tires. In the distance, flickering lights that might have been lanterns or torches lined what appeared to be an ancient roadway. But when he looked through the side windows, he still saw the familiar flat expanses of Nebraska farmland, illuminated by the pale glow of a half moon. The contradiction made his eyes water and his head throb. The CB radio crackled to life on its own, and this time Danny could understand some of the words mixed in with the strange language. His own name, spoken in voices that sounded like they were coming from the bottom of a well. Coordinates that didn't match any mapping system he knew. And underneath it all, a low humming sound that seemed to resonate in his bones. Mile marker 237 passed again, but this time, Danny was ready for it. He grabbed his logbook and pen, determined to mark the exact time and create some record of what was happening. But when he looked at the page, his previous entries were gone. The pages that should have contained days of trip records were blank, as if they'd been erased. The phantom truck in his reflection was now directly beside him, matching his speed perfectly. Danny could hear its engine, a deep, rattling sound like grinding metal and breaking glass. The driver turned to look at him, and Danny saw his own face staring back, but wrong somehow. The eyes were too wide, the mouth was open in a silent scream, and there were dark stains running down the cheeks like tears made of oil. Danny yanked the wheel hard to the right, pulling onto what should have been the shoulder of the highway. Instead, his truck rolled to a stop in a field of tall grass that whispered and moved without any wind. The engine died on its own, and the sudden silence was absolute. In that silence, Danny could hear footsteps approaching his truck. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched on gravel that wasn't there. The CB radio hissed softly, and a voice that might have been his own spoke from the speaker. Mile marker 237, you've been here before, Danny. You'll be here again. The footsteps stopped just outside his door. Danny sat frozen in his seat, afraid to look, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. In the reflection of his side mirror, he could see mile marker 237 standing in the grass beside his truck, its wooden surface now black and charred, as if it had been pulled from a fire. The numbers still glowed with that pale, cold light. He closed his eyes and counted to 10, the way his father had taught him to do when he was scared as a child. When he opened them again, he was back on Interstate 80, rolling past mile marker 238 in the pre-dawn darkness. His CB radio was playing a country music station, and the speedometer read a steady 68 miles per hour. Danny checked his logbook. The pages were filled with his handwriting, documenting a routine run from Sacramento to Chicago. Everything was normal, exactly as it should be. But in his rearview mirror, mile marker 237 still glowed in the distance behind him, and he could swear he saw his own truck parked in the grass beside it. with a figure that looked like himself standing motionless in the headlights, waiting for the next driver to pass. The radio crackled softly, and somewhere in the static, Danny heard his own voice whisper, "Mile marker 237. He drove faster, but he knew he'd be back. Marcus Chen had been driving team runs for 8 years, but tonight he was running solo. His usual partner, Ray, had called in sick at the last minute, leaving Marcus to handle the cross-country haul from Portland to Atlanta alone. The 48-foot trailer behind his Kenworth was loaded with electronics, expensive cargo that required careful handling and tight security. The company had been reluctant to let him take it solo, but Marcus had convinced them he could handle the schedule. Now, 3 hours into the run on I-84 through the Columbia River Gorge, he was beginning to question that decision. The problem wasn't the driving. Marcus was comfortable behind the wheel, even on the winding mountain roads that carved through the Oregon landscape. The problem was the sounds coming from his sleeper berth. At first, he dismissed it as normal settling noises. Trucks made all kinds of sounds as they moved down the highway. Metal expanding and contracting, cargo shifting slightly despite being properly secured, the occasional groan from the suspension. But what he was hearing from behind the curtain that separated his cab from the sleeping area wasn't mechanical. It sounded like breathing, deep, rhythmic breathing, as if someone were sleeping back there. Marcus had checked the sleeper twice before leaving Portland. It was empty except for his personal gear, a duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, his toiletries, and a cooler with sandwiches and energy drinks. The narrow bunk was made up with fresh sheets, and the small storage compartments contained nothing unusual. There was no way anyone could have hidden back there. Yet the sound continued, a soft susurrus that seemed to match the rhythm of his own breathing, but slightly off, like an echo that arrived a fraction of a second too late. The digital clock on his dashboard read 11:43 p.m. as he passed through the small town of Cascade Locks. The streets were empty, windows dark except for the occasional gas station or late-night diner. Street lights created pools of yellow illumination that his truck passed through like a ship moving between lighthouses. Marcus reached for his CB radio and keyed the mic. "Breaker 19, this is westbound looking for an eastbound on I-84. Anyone copy?" Static answered him for several seconds before a gravelly voice responded. "Yeah, westbound. This is eastbound Charlie, about 10 miles ahead of you. Go ahead." "Charlie, this is gonna sound strange, but have you seen any vehicles stopped along the highway in the last few miles? Maybe someone looking for a ride?" A pause. "Negative, westbound. Highway's been empty as a grave out here. You missing a passenger?" Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Something like that. Thanks, Charlie. Stay safe out there, driver. Charlie out." The breathing from the sleeper berth seemed to get deeper, more pronounced. Marcus could swear he felt the truck shifting slightly, as if additional weight had been added to the rear axles. He checked his mirrors, looking for any explanation, maybe another vehicle following too closely, its headlights creating shadows that might explain what he was experiencing. But the highway behind him stretched empty into the darkness. At the next way station, Marcus pulled over. The facility was closed for the night, the scale house dark and the parking area empty except for a few abandoned shopping carts that had somehow found their way there from town. He climbed out of the cab, the sudden silence after hours of engine noise making his ears ring. The air was cold and thin, carrying the scent of pine trees and river water from the Columbia below. Marcus walked around to the passenger side of his truck and pulled open the sleeper berth door. Empty. The bunk was exactly as he'd left it. Sheets still tucked in military-tight corners, his duffel bag sitting where he'd placed it. But the air inside felt different. Warmer, more humid, as if someone had been breathing in the confined space for hours. Marcus ran his hands along the walls and ceiling of the compartment, checking for any hidden spaces or loose panels where someone might have concealed themselves. Nothing. He even pulled out his duffel bag and checked inside, though he knew it was too small to hide a person. As he stood there in the cold night air, staring into the empty sleeper, he heard it again. The breathing, soft but unmistakable, coming from directly behind him. Marcus spun around. The parking lot was empty. No other vehicles, no people. Just the scattered shopping carts and the dark bulk of the way station building. But he could still hear it. Slow, measured breaths that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He climbed back into the cab and slammed the door, engaging the locks with more force than necessary. His hands were shaking as he reached for the ignition, and it took him 2 tries to get the key turned. The diesel engine rumbled to life, and Marcus felt some of his tension ease as he put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. But as soon as he reached cruising speed, the breathing resumed. This time, Marcus decided to ignore it. Whatever was happening, fatigue, stress, some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and not enough sleep. He couldn't afford to let it distract him from his delivery schedule. He had another 10 hours of driving ahead of him, and the cargo was worth more than he made in 6 months. He needed to stay focused. The radio crackled with occasional chatter from other drivers. A trucker heading west warned about a speed trap near the Dalles. Another reported construction delays in eastern Oregon. Normal, mundane communications that helped Marcus feel connected to the larger community of drivers sharing the highway with him. He even joined in a few conversations, describing the weather conditions and road surface reports. But between the radio calls, in the quiet moments when there was nothing but the sound of his engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt, he could hear his passenger breathing. Around 1:30 a.m., as he climbed into the Blue Mountains, Marcus felt the truck's performance change. The engine was working harder than it should have been for the grade, and the transmission was downshifting more frequently. He checked his gauges. Engine temperature was normal, oil pressure was good, but something was definitely wrong. At the next truck stop, a small facility carved into the mountainside near Baker City, Marcus pulled in for fuel and a mandatory break. The parking lot was nearly full, dozens of trucks lined up in neat rows like sleeping giants. Most had their running lights on, but their main engines off. Drivers catching mandatory rest in their sleepers. As Marcus climbed out to fuel up, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. His truck was sitting noticeably lower in the rear than it should have been. The rear suspension was compressed as if he were carrying a much heavier load than what was listed on his manifest. He walked around to the back of the trailer and checked the seals on the doors. They were intact, exactly as they'd been when he'd picked up the load in Portland. But something was wrong with the weight distribution. His truck was handling like it was carrying an additional several thousand pounds. Inside the truck stop, Marcus approached the clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who was restocking coffee supplies behind the counter. "Excuse me," he said. "You folks got a scale here? I think I might have a weight problem." She looked up from her work. "Cat scale's out back, but it's been acting up all week, giving weird readings. Most drivers just skip it and wait for the next way station." What kind of weird readings? The woman paused, studying his face. Trucks showing heavier than they should be. Sometimes a lot heavier. Had one driver yesterday swore his empty trailer was showing 40,000 pounds on the scale. Thought he was losing his mind. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Did he figure out what was wrong? Nope. Drove on to the next scale, and everything was normal. Like I said, our scale's been acting up. Back at his truck, Marcus stood in the parking lot and stared at his rig. In the harsh glare of the sodium lights, everything looked normal. The trailer sat at the right height, the tires showed no signs of unusual wear, and the load securement was exactly as it should be. But he could swear the truck was sitting lower than when he parked it. He walked around to the sleeper door again, hesitating with his hand on the handle. The breathing sound was audible even from outside the truck now, a soft rhythm that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. Marcus took a deep breath and pulled the door open. A smell hit him immediately, not unpleasant, but strange. It reminded him of his grandmother's attic, all dust and old fabric and the faint sweetness of dried flowers. The air inside the sleeper felt thick, almost syrupy, and warmer than it should have been. On the bunk, the sheets were rumpled now, as if someone had been lying there. The impression of a human form was clearly visible in the mattress, head, shoulders, the curve of hips. But there was something wrong with the proportions. The depression was too long, as if whoever had been sleeping there was much taller than any normal person. Marcus reached out to touch the sheets and jerked his hand back. They were warm, not just warm from residual body heat, but actively warm, as if someone had just gotten up and walked away. He could even detect a faint pulse in the fabric, like a slow, steady heartbeat. "Who are you?" he whispered into the empty sleeper. The breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear everything. The distant hum of highway traffic, the murmur of voices from other drivers in the parking lot, the ping of cooling metal from his engine. But from the sleeper berth, nothing. Then, so softly he almost missed it, a voice answered him. It sounded like his own voice, but tired, infinitely tired, as if spoken by someone who hadn't slept in years. "I'm going home." Marcus slammed the door and ran back to the truck stop, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst through the entrance, startling the clerk, and fumbled for his cell phone. He needed to call his dispatcher, tell them he couldn't complete this run, that something was seriously wrong. But when he pulled out his phone, the screen showed no signal. That was impossible. This truck stop was on a major highway, and he'd had full bars just an hour ago. The clerk looked at him with concern. "You okay, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus stared at her, then looked back through the window at his truck. In the distance, he could see a tall figure standing beside his sleeper door, barely visible in the shadows between the parking lot lights. The figure was looking directly at him through the truck stop window. It was himself, an exact duplicate, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. When Marcus blinked, the figure was gone. The clerk was still watching him with worried eyes. "Honey, maybe you should get some rest. You look like you've been driving too long." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe I should." But as he walked back toward his truck, he knew he wouldn't be sleeping tonight. In the sleeper berth, someone was waiting for him. Tommy Valdez had a rule about hitchhikers: never pick them up. In 22 years of long-haul trucking, he'd seen enough roadside disasters and heard enough cautionary tales to know that stopping for strangers was asking for trouble. But tonight, on a desolate stretch of Highway 50 through the Nevada desert, something made him break that rule. The woman was standing beside what looked like a broken-down sedan about 50 miles east of Carson City. Her car's hazard lights blinked weakly in the darkness, and she waved frantically at his approaching headlights. Tommy normally would have called it in on his CB and kept rolling. But something about her posture, the way she stood with her arms wrapped around herself against the desert cold, reminded him of his daughter Sarah. He pulled his Freightliner onto the shoulder, air brakes hissing as the truck came to a stop. Through his passenger window, he could see the woman more clearly now. She appeared to be in her 30s, wearing a light jacket that wasn't nearly warm enough for the October night. Her car, an old Honda Civic, sat at an odd angle with its hood up and steam rising from the engine compartment. Tommy rolled down his window. "You need help, ma'am." She approached the truck, her footsteps crunching on the gravel shoulder. "My car overheated. I've been out here for almost 2 hours. My phone has no signal." Her voice carried a slight accent that Tommy couldn't quite place. "Where are you heading?" he asked. "Reno. I know it's out of your way, but I can pay for gas money. I just need to get there tonight." Tommy checked his watch. 11:15 p.m. Reno was actually on his route. He was hauling computer equipment to Sacramento, and Highway 50 would take him right past the city. "I can drop you at a truck stop in Reno, but I got rules. No drugs, no alcohol, no drama." Her face lit up with relief. "Thank you so much. I'll get my bag." As she walked back to her car, Tommy noticed something odd. The woman's footprints in the sandy shoulder were clearly visible in his headlights, but they seemed to stop abruptly about 10 feet from her Honda. It was as if she had appeared beside the road rather than walked from her disabled vehicle. She returned with a small overnight bag and climbed into the passenger seat. Up close, Tommy could see that her clothes, while clean, had an old-fashioned cut to them, like something from decades past. Her perfume was subtle but strange, carrying undertones of flowers he couldn't identify. "I'm Maria," she said, settling into the seat and buckling her seatbelt. "Tommy, you comfortable? It's going to be about an hour to Reno." "Perfect. I really can't thank you enough." Tommy put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. In his mirrors, he watched Maria's Honda grow smaller and disappear into the darkness. The hazard lights continued blinking like a fading beacon. For the first few miles, Maria sat quietly, staring out at the desert landscape. The Nevada night was clear and cold, with more stars visible than most city dwellers ever saw. The highway stretched ahead of them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the emptiness. "You do this run often?" Maria asked eventually. "Couple times a month. Been driving this route for 15 years. Usually pretty quiet out here." "Quiet can be good. Sometimes it's the only time you can really think." Tommy glanced at her. In the green glow of his dashboard lights, her profile looked almost ethereal. "You from Reno originally?" "No, I'm from further away, but I have business there." Something in her tone discouraged further questions, so Tommy focused on driving. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other truckers, but Highway 50 was largely empty at this hour. This stretch of Nevada was known as the loneliest road in America, and tonight it lived up to that reputation. About 20 minutes later, Tommy noticed headlights in his mirrors. Another vehicle had caught up to them and was maintaining a steady distance behind his trailer. That wasn't unusual. Faster cars often followed trucks through the mountains to take advantage of the cleared path and better visibility. But when he checked the mirrors again a few minutes later, the headlights were gone. "Looks like your car's still running," Maria said suddenly. Tommy looked at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" She pointed past him, out the driver's side window. "Your friend back there." Tommy looked and felt his blood turn cold. Pacing his truck in the left lane was the Honda Civic, Maria's supposedly broken down Honda Civic. Its hood was down now, and it was running smoothly, keeping perfect speed with his rig. Through the windshield, he could see a figure behind the wheel. It looked like Maria. "That's impossible," Tommy said, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Your car was dead. We left it 50 miles back." Maria turned to look at him, and in the dashboard lights, her eyes seemed to reflect like an animal's. "Did we?" Tommy checked his mirrors frantically. The Honda was gone again, but now there were multiple sets of headlights behind him, 5 or 6 vehicles following in a loose convoy. They maintained perfect spacing and identical speeds, like a funeral procession. "How many people were with you?" Tommy asked, his voice barely steady. "Just the ones who needed rides." The temperature inside the cab seemed to drop 20 degrees. Tommy reached for the heater controls, but they were already set to maximum. His breath began to fog in the sudden cold. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but no game, Tommy. Just passengers who need to get where they're going." In his peripheral vision, Tommy could see that the passenger seat was no longer occupied by just Maria. There were shadows of other figures, indistinct shapes that seemed to shift and multiply when he wasn't looking directly at them. The cab felt crowded, filled with the presence of people he couldn't quite see. The radio crackled to life on its own, and Tommy heard his own voice speaking. "Breaker 19, this is Tommy Valdez eastbound on Highway 50. I've got passengers now. They need rides." Tommy grabbed the CB microphone, but his hands passed right through it. The device was still there, still crackling with transmissions, but he couldn't touch it. When he tried to reach for the steering wheel, his hands encountered nothing but air, even though he could see his fingers wrapped around the wheel. "What's happening to me?" he whispered. "You stopped," Maria said, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You broke your rule. You picked us up." The convoy of vehicles behind him was growing. In his mirrors, Tommy could count dozens of headlights now. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, even what looked like a horse-drawn wagon. All of them maintaining that same perfect formation, all following his Freightliner through the Nevada desert. "We've all been waiting," Maria continued, "standing by our broken-down cars, our empty gas tanks, our flat tires, waiting for someone kind enough to stop. Someone like you." Tommy tried to press the brake pedal, but his foot found only empty space. The truck continued at a steady 65 miles per hour, guided by hands he could no longer feel on a wheel he could no longer touch. "Where are we going?" he asked. "The same place we were always going. The same place everyone goes eventually." The landscape outside was changing. The familiar desert scrub was giving way to something else. Rolling hills covered in mist, trees that looked more like monuments than living plants. The highway remained solid beneath his wheels, but everything else had transformed into something that belonged to no map Tommy had ever seen. In the distance, he could see lights that might have been a city, but they flickered and wavered like candles in the wind. The stars above had rearranged themselves into patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Reno?" Tommy asked hopefully. "In a way," Everyone's final destination looks like home at first. The convoy behind him had grown enormous now. Hundreds of vehicles stretching back into the darkness, all carrying passengers who had once stood beside broken-down cars on lonely highways. Tommy could see them clearly now in his mirrors. Men and women and children from different eras, all wearing the clothes of their time, all with the same patient expressions of people who had been waiting a very long time for a ride. And at the front of the convoy, directly behind his trailer, was his own freightliner. Tommy could see himself behind the wheel, a perfect duplicate, but with eyes that stared straight ahead without blinking. "When did I break down?" he asked. "About 50 miles back, right around the time you saw me standing by my car." Tommy tried to remember stopping, but the memory was hazy. Had he pulled over for some reason? Had his truck developed a problem he couldn't recall? "The tow truck will find you in the morning," Maria said gently. "Heart attack, they'll say. Probably happened quickly. You're lucky. Some of us waited by the roadside for decades before someone stopped." The lights ahead were growing brighter, and Tommy could make out buildings now. Familiar structures that reminded him of his childhood home in El Paso. But somehow improved, perfected. The air in the cab was warming again, filled with the scent of his mother's cooking and the sound of his daughter's laughter from when she was small. "It's not so bad," Maria said. "And now you get to help others, like you helped me." Tommy looked in his mirrors one last time. The convoy stretched behind him like a river of lights, carrying all the lost travelers who had ever needed a ride home. At the very back, barely visible in the distance, he could see a new figure standing beside a broken-down freightliner. The figure was waving frantically at the approaching headlights, hoping someone would be kind enough to stop. Tommy smiled and pressed the accelerator, eager to pick up his first passenger. Frank Morrison had been running freight between Memphis and Phoenix for 12 years, and he knew every truck stop, every diner, and every rest area along U40. So when he saw the sign for Desert Rose Truck Plaza at mile marker 311 in eastern Arizona, he knew something was wrong. There had never been a truck stop at mile marker 311. Frank checked his GPS, but the display showed only static. His atlas, dog-eared from years of use, indicated nothing but empty desert between Holbrook and Winslow. Yet there it was, a fully lit truck stop with diesel pumps, a restaurant, and what looked like a small motel, all gleaming under sodium lights that turned the surrounding desert an eerie orange. His fuel gauge showed a quarter tank, more than enough to reach Flagstaff. But something about the sight of those lights in the vast darkness made him signal and take the exit. Frank told himself it was professional curiosity. Truckers talked, and news of a new stop on this route would have spread through the CB networks within days. The off-ramp curved around a low hill, and as Frank descended toward the facility, he noticed how quiet his radio had become. The usual chatter from other drivers had faded to silence, leaving only the steady hum of his Cummins engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. The parking lot was about half full, maybe 20 trucks arranged in neat rows beneath tall light poles. Frank recognized some of the rigs. A distinctive flame-painted Peterbilt that belonged to a driver called Phoenix Phil. A well-maintained Kenworth that he'd seen at the Flying J in Amarillo just last week. Normal trucks driven by drivers he knew, which made him feel better about the unexpected stop. Frank pulled into an empty space and shut down his engine. The sudden silence felt heavier than it should have, as if the desert night had thickened around the truck stop like syrup. He climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching on gravel that seemed unusually white in the artificial lighting. The fuel island was modern, with digital displays and credit card readers that looked like they'd been installed yesterday. But when Frank ran his card through the reader, it processed the transaction using an authorization method he didn't recognize. No signature required, no PIN, just a green light that seemed to stay on longer than necessary. As he fueled his truck, Frank looked around at the other vehicles. The trucks all appeared normal from a distance, but up close, small details seemed off. Phoenix Phil's flame paint job, which Frank remembered as bright orange and red, now appeared muted, as if the colors had faded over many years. The chrome on the nearby Kenworth was dulled with what looked like decades of road grime, despite appearing pristine from across the lot. The fuel pump clicked off, showing exactly 150 gallons, a number that felt too round, too convenient. Frank's tank held 200 gallons, and he'd started with a quarter tank. But the math didn't feel right somehow. Inside the truck stop, fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that made Frank's teeth ache. The layout was familiar: aisles of snacks and road supplies, coffee stations, a small restaurant area with vinyl booths and a lunch counter. But the products on the shelves looked wrong, like generic versions of brands he knew. The Coca-Cola logo was almost right, but the font was slightly different. The Marlboro packs had the correct colors, but the wrong proportions. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and a name tag that read, Dorothy. She smiled when Frank approached, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Evening, hun. Getting some fuel?" "Yeah, just topped off. Nice place you got here. How long you been open?" Dorothy's smile flickered. "Oh, seems like forever. You heading west?" "Phoenix. Been running this route for years. Never noticed this stop before." "Well, we're not on all the maps yet. Still getting ourselves established." She paused, studying Frank's face. "You look tired, hun. Maybe you should stay the night. We got clean rooms, reasonable rates." Frank hadn't planned to sleep. He was making good time and wanted to reach Phoenix by morning. But something about Dorothy's suggestion felt compelling, as if the idea had been planted in his mind rather than offered. "I should keep moving. Got a tight delivery schedule." "Of course you do. But the desert can be dangerous at night. A lot of accidents on that stretch between here and Flagstaff. Animals on the road, sudden weather changes. Much safer to rest up and leave at dawn." The restaurant area was busier than Frank had expected for 2 a.m. A dozen truckers sat in the booths, eating meals and drinking coffee. Frank recognized several faces, drivers he'd seen at truck stops from California to Tennessee. They all looked up when he entered, nodding in that universal acknowledgement truckers gave each other. But something about their expressions seemed distant, unfocused. Frank slid into an empty booth and picked up the laminated menu. The offerings were standard truck stop fare: burgers, fried chicken, breakfast served all day. But the prices were listed in handwritten numbers that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. A waitress appeared beside his table. She was young, maybe 25, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and a uniform that looked like it belonged in a 1950s diner. Her name tag read, Susie. "What can I get you, sweetie?" "Just coffee and maybe a piece of pie." "Apple or cherry?" Frank almost said apple, then hesitated. He always ordered apple pie, had been ordering apple pie at truck stops for more than a decade. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, he said, "Cherry." Susie's smile brightened. "Good choice. Cherry's our specialty." As she walked away, Frank noticed that her footsteps made no sound on the linoleum floor. He looked around the restaurant more carefully. The other truckers were eating and talking, but he couldn't quite make out their conversations. The words seemed to blur together, like voices heard through water. The coffee arrived in a heavy ceramic mug that radiated warmth. It tasted perfect, exactly the way truck stop coffee should taste. But there was an underlying flavor Frank couldn't identify. Something sweet and metallic, like copper pennies dissolved in honey. The cherry pie was enormous, a slice that would have satisfied two normal appetites. The crust was golden brown, the filling a deep red that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. Frank took a bite and closed his eyes. It was the best pie he'd ever tasted, filled with flavors that reminded him of his grandmother's baking when he was a child. When he opened his eyes, the restaurant had changed. The other truckers were still there, but now Frank could see them clearly. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes reflected the overhead lights like mirrors. They were still eating, still moving, but with mechanical precision, as if they were going through motions they'd repeated thousands of times. Phoenix Phil sat 3 booths away, cutting into a steak that bled more than any cooked meat should. When Phil looked up and waved, Frank could see that his smile was too wide, stretching beyond the normal boundaries of his face. "Good pie, isn't it?" Susie had returned, refilling his coffee cup with liquid that looked more black than brown in the harsh lighting. "What is this place?" Frank asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Just a truck stop, sweetie. A place for tired drivers to rest." "How long have these guys been here?" Susie glanced around the restaurant. "Oh, they come and go. Some stay longer than others. Depends on how tired they are, I guess." Frank stood up abruptly, pulling a 20 from his wallet. "I need to get back on the road." "You sure? You've barely touched your pie, and it's such a long way to the next stop." "I'm sure." But as Frank headed for the door, he found his legs moving slower than they should. Each step felt like he was walking through thick mud. The exit seemed to be getting farther away instead of closer. "Most folks find it easier to just stay," Dorothy called from behind the counter. "No point fighting it, hun. This is where you were always heading anyway." Frank looked back at the truckers in the booths. Now he could see them clearly. Drivers he'd known over the years who had simply disappeared from the highways. Men who had left for routine runs and never arrived at their destinations. Never called home, never collected their final paychecks. They were all here, eating endless meals in a truck stop that existed between destinations. A place for drivers who had run their last mile but didn't know how to stop. "We've been waiting for you, Frank," Phoenix Phil called out, his voice echoing strangely in the restaurant. "Saved you a seat." Frank reached for the door handle, but his hand passed through it like it was made of smoke. Outside, he could see his truck sitting in the parking lot. But it looked different now, older, covered with the dust of decades instead of days. "The thing about the last stop," Dorothy said gently, "is that you don't really choose to make it. It chooses you." Frank turned back to the restaurant. The empty booth where he'd been sitting now had a plate of cherry pie waiting for him, the slice exactly as large as when he'd first been served. Steam rose from a fresh cup of coffee. Phoenix Phil patted the seat beside him. "Come on, Frank. Rest up. We got all the time in the world now." Frank walked back to the booth, his footsteps making no sound on the linoleum. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, but Highway 40 was nowhere to be seen. There was only the truck stop, glowing like a beacon in an ocean of darkness, welcoming weary travelers who would never need to travel again. He sat down and picked up his fork. The cherry pie tasted just as perfect as before. Sweet and warm and somehow familiar. Like a flavor from a dream he'd been having his entire life without knowing it. In the parking lot, his truck waited patiently, ready for a journey that would never end. Eddie Reeves always drove with his CB radio on Channel 19, the trucker's channel, where drivers shared road conditions, speed traps, and the kind of casual conversation that made the long miles feel shorter. Tonight, running a load of farm equipment from Des Moines to Denver, the radio had been unusually quiet. Just static and the occasional weather report from distant stations bleeding through the atmospheric interference. Eddie was used to solitude. He'd been an owner-operator for 18 years, hauling everything from refrigerated goods to construction materials across the Midwest. But something about tonight's silence felt different, almost expectant, as if the radio waves themselves were holding their breath. He was 40 miles west of North Platte, Nebraska, when the transmissions began. At first, it was just a whisper beneath the static. Voices too faint to understand, speaking in what sounded like numbers and coordinates. Eddie adjusted his squelch control and fine-tuned the frequency, thinking he might be picking up military or aviation communications. But as the signal strengthened, he realized the voices were using trucker terminology. Eastbound at marker 247, got your ears on. Copy that, driver. How's your back door looking? Clean and green all the way to the state line. Normal CB chatter, except for one problem. Eddie was currently at mile marker 247, and there was no eastbound traffic visible in either direction. The Nebraska highway stretched empty in both directions, illuminated only by his headlights and the pale glow of a quarter moon. Eddie keyed his microphone. Breaker 19, this is westbound Eddie at marker 247. I copy you eastbound drivers, but I don't see you on the highway. What's your 20? Silence answered him. Not even static now, just a complete absence of sound that made Eddie wonder if his radio had suddenly died. He checked the power light, tapped the microphone, even switched to channel 9 and back to 19. Nothing. Then, as if someone had turned up the volume, the voices returned, clearer now and much closer. Eddie Reeves, westbound in the Blue Pete. We see you, driver. Eddie's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He hadn't identified himself or his truck over the radio. His Peterbilt was indeed blue, but in the darkness, that would be impossible to determine from any distance. How do you know my name? He transmitted. Same way we know you're hauling John Deere equipment. Same way we know you got that photo of your granddaughter taped to your dashboard. We've been waiting for you to join us, Eddie. A chill ran down Eddie's spine. The photo of 7-year-old Emma was exactly where the voice said it would be, smiling at him from its place beside his logbook. But nobody could see inside his cab, and he'd never mentioned his cargo or family on the radio. Who is this? How do you know that information? Look in your mirrors, Eddie. We're right behind you. Eddie checked his mirrors and felt his breath catch. A convoy of trucks had appeared in the darkness behind him. 5, maybe 6 rigs running in tight formation without headlights. In the faint moonlight, he could just make out their shapes. Older trucks mostly, with the high hoods and chrome bumpers of models from decades past. How did you catch up so fast? I didn't see you coming. We've been running this route a long time, Eddie. Longer than you might think. Why don't you pull over and join our convoy? Make the miles go by easier. Something in the voice's tone set off alarm bells in Eddie's head. He'd heard that same too friendly cadence from lot lizards and con men at truck stops, the sound of someone trying to lure him into something he'd regret. "Thanks, but I'm making good time. I'll just keep running solo." The laughter that came through his radio was like gravel being poured into a metal bucket. "Solo? Look around, Eddie. Count the trucks." Eddie looked in his mirrors again. The convoy had grown. What had been 5 or 6 trucks was now at least a dozen, all running dark, all maintaining perfect formation. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. In his passenger mirror, he could see another truck running parallel to him in the left lane, a truck that looked exactly like his own, Peterbilt. Same blue paint, same chrome stacks, even the same company logo on the door. And behind the wheel of that duplicate truck, Eddie could see his own face staring back at him. "What the hell?" "Easy there, Eddie. No need to get excited. Just pull over and let us explain everything. You're gonna like being part of the convoy." Eddie pressed harder on the accelerator, but his truck's speed remained constant at 65 miles per hour. The speedometer needle was steady, his engine was responding normally, but the landscape outside continued to scroll past at the same measured pace no matter how hard he pushed the pedal. "Let me go," he said into the microphone. "Go where, Eddie?" "You're on Highway 80 heading west. Same as us, same as you always have been, same as you always will be." The convoy in his mirrors had expanded again. Now there were dozens of trucks, semis, delivery vehicles, even what looked like a few pickup trucks towing trailers, all running without lights, all moving in perfect synchronization. Eddie tried his cell phone, but the screen showed no signal. He reached for his satellite radio, hoping to contact his dispatcher, but the unit was dead despite showing a full power indicator. "Nobody can hear you now except us," the voice on the CB said. "Channel 19 is our frequency, has been for a long time." "What do you want?" "Same thing every trucker wants, Eddie. Company on the road, someone to talk to during the long hours, someone who understands the life." The duplicate of his truck was still running beside him, and now Eddie could see the driver more clearly. It was himself, but wrong. The face was too pale, the eyes were solid black, and the mouth was stretched in a smile that never wavered. "I've been driving alone for 18 years, Eddie said. "I don't need company." "Everybody needs company eventually. Gets lonely out here, doesn't it? Same roads, same truck stops, same load after load. Wouldn't it be nice to have drivers who really understand? Who've been through exactly what you've been through?" Eddie looked more carefully at the trucks in his mirrors. Now he could make out details. Company logos from freight lines that had gone out of business decades ago. Truck models that hadn't been manufactured since the 1980s. License plates from states that no longer existed. "You're all dead," he whispered. "Dead is such a harsh word, Eddie. We prefer to think of ourselves as permanently on the road. No more delivery schedules, no more DOT inspections, no more worrying about fuel prices or insurance premiums. Just the highway and the brotherhood of drivers." The convoy had surrounded him now. Trucks flanked him on both sides, filled his mirrors front and back. Eddie was trapped in the center of a rolling formation of vehicles that shouldn't exist, driven by men who should have been in graves instead of behind steering wheels. "The thing about trucking," the voice continued, "is that it gets in your blood, becomes part of who you are. Some of us just couldn't let it go when our time came. So we kept driving. I want out of this." "Out of what, Eddie?" "You're doing exactly what you've always done. Driving west on I-80, hauling freight, living the life you chose. The only difference is now you got convoy partners who'll never let you drive alone again. Eddie tried turning the wheel, but it wouldn't respond. His truck continued straight ahead, maintaining its position in the center of the ghostly convoy. The radio crackled with new voices now. Dozens of them, all talking at once in the easy familiarity of drivers who'd been running together for years. "Good buddy in the blue, Pete. Welcome to the convoy. Been waiting for a John Deere specialist. Got some loads need hauling. That granddaughter of yours. She'll understand why Grandpa can't visit anymore." "Stop," Eddie said. But his voice came out as barely a whisper. Outside, the landscape was changing. The familiar Nebraska farmland was giving way to something else. Rolling hills covered in mist, forests of trees that looked more like telephone poles. And in the distance, lights that might have been cities, but moved like living things. "This isn't I-80 anymore," Eddie said. "Sure it is. It's every highway, every route, every mile of road you've ever driven. All connected now, all leading to the same place." "Where?" "The depot, Eddie. The final terminal. Where all loads get delivered eventually." In the distance, Eddie could see it. A massive truck stop that stretched beyond the horizon, with thousands of bays and fuel islands and parking spaces filled with trucks from every era of American transportation. Beyond, lights never flickered, the fuel never ran out, and the drivers never had to sleep. "Welcome to the convoy, Eddie," the voice said as his truck rolled toward the depot. "You're gonna love it here. We all do." Eddie reached for the photo of his granddaughter, but his hand passed through it like smoke. In the passenger seat, another Eddie was already sitting there, smiling that same too wide smile. "Don't worry," his duplicate said. "I'll take good care of the truck and the route. Someone has to keep running the loads." Behind them, the convoy rolled on through the endless night, always recruiting, always growing, always making sure that no trucker ever had to drive alone. On Highway 80, a blue Peterbilt maintained its steady westward pace, while somewhere in the static between radio channels, Eddie Reeves tried to remember what it felt like to choose his own destination. Carl Hendricks prided himself on being meticulous about paperwork. In 30 years of hauling freight across the continental United States, he'd never had a discrepancy with a bill of lading, never lost a shipping document, and never failed a DOT inspection. His logbooks were models of precision. His cargo manifests matched his loads down to the last pound. And his truck maintenance records were so detailed they could have been used as training materials. So when Carl noticed that his manifest had changed sometime between Little Rock and Memphis, he knew something was seriously wrong. He'd picked up the load at a food processing plant in Arkansas. 10 pallets of frozen chicken bound for a distribution center in Detroit. Standard refrigerated cargo, nothing unusual about the pickup or the paperwork. Carl had checked the manifest 3 times before pulling away from the dock, a habit that had saved him from costly mistakes more than once in his career. The original manifest listed the cargo as Tyson Frozen Chicken Products, Grade A, 10 pallets, 18,500 pounds total. But now, as he sat in the sleeper berth of his Kenworth during his mandatory rest break at a truck stop outside Memphis, the document in his hands read something entirely different. Livestock, live transport, 47 head, 22,000 pounds total. Carl read the line 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding something. He pulled out his reading glasses and examined the manifest under the overhead light. The paper was the same. He recognized the coffee stain in the upper right corner from when he'd set his mug down too close to the paperwork back in Little Rock. But the words had definitely changed. He walked around to the back of his trailer and checked the seals on the doors. They were intact, exactly as they'd been when he'd left Arkansas. The refrigeration unit was running normally, maintaining the required temperature for frozen goods. Everything appeared normal, except for the impossible transformation of his shipping documents. Carl climbed back into his cab and spread the manifest on his dashboard, comparing it to the pickup receipt he'd gotten from the loading dock supervisor. The receipt still showed frozen chicken products, but the manifest now clearly indicated live cattle. As he stared at the conflicting documents, Carl became aware of a sound coming from behind him, a low rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the metal walls of his trailer. At first, he thought it might be the refrigeration unit cycling on, but the sound was deeper, more rhythmic. It almost sounded like breathing, heavy breathing from something very large. Carl grabbed his flashlight and walked back to his trailer. The refrigeration unit was humming quietly, but the other sound was definitely coming from inside the cargo area. He pressed his ear against the aluminum siding and heard it clearly now. Not just breathing, but movement. Shuffling, scraping sounds, as if something was shifting around in the confined space, something alive. He checked the seals again, looking for any sign of tampering. They were intact, but as Carl examined them more closely, he noticed that the serial numbers had changed. The seals he'd watched the dock supervisor apply had been numbered 74,832 and 74,833. These seals read 91,205 and 91,206. Carl's hands were shaking as he pulled out his cell phone and called his dispatcher. Morrison Freight, this is Janet. Janet, this is Carl Hendricks, truck 47. I've got a problem with my load documentation. What kind of problem, Carl? My manifest says I'm hauling live cattle, but I picked up frozen chicken, and the trailer seals have changed. A pause. Carl, you feeling okay? You've been driving too long? I'm fine, Janet. I'm telling you something's wrong with this load. Hold on, let me check your dispatch record. Carl could hear typing in the background. Carl, according to our system, you picked up livestock from Ramirez Ranch outside Little Rock. 47 head of cattle bound for a slaughterhouse in Detroit. That's what your manifest should show. Carl stared at the phone. That's impossible. I was at a Tyson plant. I loaded chicken. Carl, Ramirez Ranch has been your pickup location for the last 15 years. Same route, same cargo. You okay, driver? Maybe you should pull over and get some rest. The line went dead. Carl tried calling back, but his phone showed no signal despite being in the middle of Memphis. He walked into the truck stop and used the payphone, but when he dialed the Morrison Freight number, a recorded message told him the number was disconnected. Back at his truck, Carl found that his logbook had changed too. The entries he'd made over the past 3 days now showed pickups from Ramirez Ranch, cattle loads, routes he'd never driven. His handwriting, but documenting trips he'd never made. The sounds from the trailer were getting louder, along with the breathing and movement. Carl could now hear what sounded like lowing, the deep, mournful calls of cattle in distress. But underneath those sounds was something else, something that made his skin crawl. It sounded like voices, human voices, calling out in languages he didn't recognize. Carl walked to the front of his truck and opened the hood, pretending to check his engine while he tried to make sense of what was happening. In the reflection of his polished air filter housing, he could see his trailer clearly, but the reflection showed something that shouldn't be there. Shadows moving behind the aluminum walls, shapes too large and too angular to be cattle. He slammed the hood and leaned against his truck, breathing heavily. A trucker at the next pump over approached him. "You okay, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost." Carl looked at the man. A typical over-the-road driver, middle-aged, wearing a company shirt from a freight line Carl recognized. Normal, real. "Yeah, just tired. Long run." "I hear that. What you hauling?" Carl hesitated. "Livestock." The other driver nodded. "Tough freight. Never could do the cattle runs myself. Too depressing, you know, all that mooing and carrying on. And the smell when you get to the processing plant?" He shook his head. "Rather haul steel or machinery. At least metal don't know where it's going." After the man walked away, Carl climbed back into his cab and examined his manifest again. The document now showed additional details that hadn't been there before. Special handling required. Do not open trailer under any circumstances. Deliver to Detroit Meat Processing, Dock 7, after midnight only. Carl had never heard of Detroit Meat Processing. His original destination had been a ConAgra distribution center on the east side of the city. He checked his GPS for the new address, but the device showed only static. When he tried to enter the address manually, the GPS kept reverting to his original destination. The trailer was rocking now, as if the cattle inside were becoming agitated. Carl could hear impacts against the walls, heavy thuds that made the entire rig shake. Whatever was in there was getting restless. He started his engine and pulled back onto Interstate 40, heading toward Interstate 55 north. He needed to get to Detroit and sort this out with whoever was expecting this load. But as he drove, Carl noticed that the mile markers weren't progressing in the right sequence. He passed marker 278 3 times, and the road signs began showing destinations he'd never heard of. Cities with names like Perdition and Nowhere and Last Chance. The CB radio crackled to life on its own. "Eastbound cattle hauler, this is your final destination calling." Carl grabbed the microphone. "Who is this? How do you know what I'm hauling?" "We've been waiting for you, Carl. Got the chutes ready, got the paperwork prepared. You're running a little behind schedule." "What schedule?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Check your manifest, driver. Should have all the details." Carl looked down at the manifest on his passenger seat. The destination address was changing as he watched, the letters rearranging themselves. Eternal Processing, 666 Judgment Road, Detroit, Michigan, Netherworld Division. The sounds from his trailer had evolved into something that definitely wasn't cattle. Carl could hear screaming now, human screaming, in voices that spoke in dozens of different languages. Pleading, bargaining, praying in tongues he'd never heard but somehow understood. "What am I carrying?" he whispered into the microphone. "Souls, Carl. Same thing you've been hauling for 15 years. Folks who made certain choices, signed certain contracts. Time to collect on their debts." Carl checked his mirrors and saw that his trailer had changed. What had been a standard refrigerated unit was now something else entirely. Black metal inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at. Smoke rising from vents that hadn't been there before. "I never agreed to this. I haul freight, not whatever this is." "Check your employment contract, Carl. Read the fine print." Carl reached for his paperwork folder and pulled out his contract with Morrison Freight. But the company name had changed to Morrigan Transport, Infernal Division. And the job description now read, "Soul Collection and Transport Services. Driver agrees to eternal employment terms upon completion of month training period. At the bottom of the contract, in Carl's own handwriting, was a signature he didn't remember making and a date from 15 years ago. "Welcome to your permanent route, Carl," the voice on the radio said. "Detroit's just the first stop. After that, we got pickups scheduled all over creation. Lots of folks ready for their final ride." Carl looked in his rearview mirror and saw other trucks forming up behind him. A convoy of black haulers, all carrying the same impossible cargo. In the distance, the lights of Detroit were visible, but they flickered red now instead of white. His CB radio crackled with new instructions. Coordinates, pickup schedules, and delivery requirements for a route that would never end. Carl reached for his logbook to document the trip, but his hands were no longer entirely his own. Someone else was guiding his movements now, filling out paperwork for destinations that existed on no earthly map. In the trailer behind him, the cargo had gone quiet, resigned to their fate. Carl wondered how long it would be before he joined them.